Tonight, we invite you to drift into slumber as we chronicle history's most tyrannical rulers. From ancient emperors to modern dictators, these stories of unchecked authority will guide you toward peaceful rest. As the gentle evening shadows lengthen and your mind prepares for rest, let us travel back to ancient Rome, where perhaps the most notorious emperor in history once ruled. On a warm summer day in the year 12, in the city of Antium, a child was born who would become synonymous with imperial madness. His birth name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but the world would remember him by a childhood nickname, Caligula, meaning little boots. This name originated from his childhood days, spent among the legions commanded by his father, the celebrated General Germanicus. The soldiers, amused by the sight of this small boy, dressed in miniature military garb, with tiny soldier's boots, affectionately called him Caligula. How strange that a name given with such fondness would one day evoke horror and disgrace throughout the Roman world. The path that led this child to power was paved with tragedy. His father, Germanicus, beloved by the Roman people and considered by many the ideal successor to Emperor Tiberius, died under mysterious circumstances when Caligula was only 7 years old. Many whispered that Tiberius himself had ordered the poisoning, fearing Germanicus's popularity. This early loss marked the beginning of Caligula's encounter with imperial politics at its most treacherous. The years following his father's death brought further sorrows. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, who openly accused Tiberius of murder, was exiled to a remote island where she starved to death. His 2 elder brothers were arrested on charges of treason and died in imperial prisons. By some combination of luck, cunning, and perhaps the emperor's calculation, young Caligula alone among his siblings was spared. At 18, he was summoned to the island of Capri, where the aging Emperor Tiberius had retreated from public life. For 6 years, Caligula lived in this strange, isolated court, witnessing the elderly emperor's cruelties and excesses firsthand. He learned to conceal his thoughts, to smile while in danger, and to navigate the treacherous waters of imperial favor. These lessons in survival would serve him well, though at great cost to his character. When Tiberius finally died in the year 37, Caligula, now 24, ascended to the throne with the enthusiastic support of both the Roman people and the Praetorian Guard. Rome rejoiced at the prospect of a young, energetic emperor from the bloodline of the beloved Germanicus. The early months of his reign seemed to fulfill these hopes. He abolished the treason trials that had terrorized Rome under Tiberius, destroyed the emperor's secret evidence files, recalled political exiles, and reduced taxes. The new emperor hosted magnificent games and distributed generous gifts to the public. He was charming, accessible, and seemingly devoted to the welfare of his people. The Roman Senate, so long oppressed under Tiberius, breathed a collective sigh of relief. A new golden age appeared to be dawning for the empire, but then the dream shattered. After approximately 6 months of benevolent rule, Caligula fell seriously ill. Some historians suggest he suffered from encephalitis, others point to epilepsy or poisoning. Whatever the cause, when he recovered, he was dramatically changed. The compassionate young ruler vanished, replaced by a figure of mounting cruelty and bizarre behavior. The transformation began subtly, but accelerated with frightening speed. Caligula started to exhibit a towering sense of his own importance, insisting on being addressed as a living god. He appeared in public dressed variously as Apollo, Mercury, Venus, and other deities. He ordered the heads removed from statues of gods throughout Rome and replaced with his own likeness. A massive temple was constructed in his honor where citizens were expected to worship him. His treatment of the Roman Senate, initially respectful, devolved into calculated humiliation. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot like servants or stand at attention during lengthy dinners where they went unfed. He appointed his horse, Incitatus, as a priest and announced plans to make it a consul, one of Rome's highest offices. Whether this was madness or a deliberate mockery of the Senate's dignity remains debated by historians. Caligula's financial extravagance drained Rome's treasury with astonishing speed. He squandered the vast reserves accumulated by the frugal Tiberius on elaborate spectacles, personal luxuries, and architectural follies. He built two massive ships for Lake Nemi that were essentially floating palaces with heated floors, plumbing, and mosaic decorations. He began constructing a bridge of boats across the Bay of Baie simply to prove wrong a prediction that he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the bay. When money ran short, Caligula turned to increasingly predatory methods of raising funds. He revived old taxes and invented new ones, charging for everything from food to weddings to litigation. He established a brothel in the imperial palace, staffing it with the wives and daughters of aristocratic families. Perhaps most cruelly, he would auction off the possessions of condemned men, often attending the sales personally to intimidate bidders into paying inflated prices. His personal behavior grew increasingly erratic and sadistic. During gladiatorial games, when the supply of condemned criminals to face the beasts ran low, he ordered spectators from the first 5 rows to be thrown into the arena instead. He forced parents to witness the executions of their sons. At dinner parties, he would suddenly burst into hysterical laughter, and when asked about the cause of his mirth, would reply, "I was just thinking that I could have all your throats cut at a single nod." Most disturbing was Caligula's relationship with his sisters, particularly his favorite, Drusilla. Contemporary sources suggest an incestuous relationship, and when she died suddenly in the year 38, his grief was unbounded. He declared her a goddess, made it a capital crime to laugh, bathe, or dine with relatives during the mourning period, and later claimed she had been transformed into a star. After her death, his treatment of his other sisters oscillated between adoration and cruelty. Caligula's mental state continued to deteriorate. He suffered from insomnia, often wandering the palace corridors at night, begging for dawn to come. He would talk to the moon and invite Jupiter to share his throne. His physical appearance became as strange as his behavior. He cultivated a deliberately terrifying countenance and experimented with bizarre costumes and makeup. His foreign policy, if it can be called that, was equally irrational. His planned invasion of Britain was abandoned at the last moment when he supposedly declared war on Neptune instead, ordering his soldiers to gather seashells as spoils of war. He announced a campaign against Germany, but turned back at the Rhine. In the east, he nearly provoked a Jewish rebellion by attempting to place his statue in the temple in Jerusalem. By the year 41, Rome had endured almost 4 years of Caligula's increasingly unhinged rule. a conspiracy formed among officers of the Praetorian Guard, including the guard's prefect and several senators who had suffered humiliation and lived in constant fear. On January 24th, as the emperor was leaving a theatrical performance, the conspirators struck. In a secluded passage, they stabbed him repeatedly. Legend claims that to ensure the deed was complete, the assassins not only stabbed his body 30 times, but also consumed small pieces of his flesh. The conspirators also killed Caligula's wife Caesonia and their infant daughter, brutally eliminating his bloodline. For a brief moment, the Senate considered restoring the Roman Republic, but the Praetorian Guard found Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace and proclaimed him emperor, ensuring the continuation of the imperial system. Caligula's body was only partially cremated before being hastily buried. Later, his sisters, returning from exile, gave him a proper cremation and placed his ashes in the mausoleum of Augustus. After his death, the Senate ordered a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory, attempting to erase him from history by destroying his statues and removing his name from public monuments. Yet Caligula could not be forgotten. His brief reign demonstrated how quickly absolute power could corrupt, how the boundary between divinity and humanity could blur in a ruler's mind, and how even the most sophisticated society could fall under the sway of madness when embodied in imperial authority. As you drift toward sleep, consider the tragic arc of Caligula's life, from the beloved child in miniature boots to the emperor whose name would become synonymous with tyrannical insanity. Perhaps in his story lies a warning about the fragility of reason when confronted with unlimited power, and the vulnerability of civilizations to the whims of those who rule them. In our next chapter, we'll explore the reign of another infamous Roman emperor, Nero, who allegedly played his lyre while Rome burned around him. But for now, rest peacefully, far from the dangerous corridors of imperial Rome, where flattery turned to fear, and where even the mighty lived at the mercy of a madman's changing moods. In the year 37 after Christ, a child was born who would become one of Rome's most notorious emperors. His name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, though history would know him as Nero. Born into a family already stained with violence and ambition, Nero's path to power was paved with intrigue, murder, and the machinations of his formidable mother, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina was the sister of Caligula and had survived the chaos of his reign through cunning and careful political maneuvering. After marrying Emperor Claudius, her uncle, she persuaded him to adopt her son Nero as his heir, displacing Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. When Claudius died in the year 54, possibly poisoned by Agrippina herself, 16-year-old Nero ascended to the throne of the Roman Empire. The first 5 years of Nero's reign, known as the Quinquennium Neronis, were surprisingly peaceful and prosperous. Guided by the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, the young emperor showed promise as a capable ruler. He reduced taxes, improved the judicial system, and supported the arts. But beneath this veneer of competent governance, darker impulses were stirring. Nero's relationship with his mother began to deteriorate as he grew increasingly resentful of her influence. Agrippina had effectively ruled through her son, but Nero yearned to escape her control. The breaking point came when Nero fell in love with Poppaea Sabina, the wife of his friend Otho. Agrippina opposed this relationship, preferring Nero's current wife, Octavia, who was Claudius's daughter and helped legitimize Nero's claim to power. In the year 59, Nero decided to rid himself of his mother permanently. His first attempt was elaborately theatrical. He arranged for Agrippina to sail in a specially constructed boat designed to collapse and sink. When she survived by swimming to shore, Nero abandoned subtlety and simply sent assassins to kill her. As she died, Agrippina reportedly bared her stomach and told her killers to strike her womb, saying, "Strike here," for this bore Nero. Free from his mother's influence, Nero's behavior became increasingly erratic. He divorced Octavia on false charges of adultery and had her executed when the public protested. He married Poppaea, but later killed her too, allegedly kicking her to death while she was pregnant during a fit of rage. His personal life descended into a series of bizarre and scandalous relationships, including a marriage to a young freedman named Sporus, whom Nero had castrated and dressed as a woman to resemble his dead wife Poppaea. But Nero's true passion was not politics, but performance. He fancied himself a great artist, particularly as a singer and lyre player. He forced senators and nobles to attend his lengthy musical performances, where leaving early or falling asleep could result in severe punishment. Guards were stationed at the exits of theaters to prevent escape. He participated in public competitions, always winning first prize. No judge dared award him anything less. The emperor's artistic pretensions reached their peak when he embarked on a tour of Greece, competing in every major festival. He won 1,808 prizes in various contests, including a chariot race where he fell from his vehicle and couldn't complete the course. He was still declared the winner. He even competed in the Olympics, where new events were created specifically to showcase his talents. On the night of July the 18th, in the year 64, a catastrophic fire broke out in Rome. Beginning in the shops around the Circus Maximus, the flames spread rapidly through the city's narrow streets and wooden buildings. The fire raged for 6 days, destroying 10 of Rome's 14 districts. 3 districts were completely leveled, while 7 others suffered severe damage. While the famous story of Nero fiddling while Rome burned is likely apocryphal, the fiddle hadn't been invented yet. Contemporary accounts do suggest he may have sung about the destruction of Troy while watching the flames. Initially, Nero responded appropriately to the disaster, opening his palaces to house the homeless and organizing relief efforts. However, rumors soon spread that he had ordered the fire himself to clear land for his ambitious building projects. These suspicions seemed confirmed when Nero unveiled plans for the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, a vast palace complex that would cover a third of Rome. This architectural monstrosity featured a 120-foot statue of Nero, artificial lakes, and rooms decorated with gold, precious gems, and elaborate frescoes. The Roman historian Suetonius reported that when the Golden House was completed, Nero declared, "At last I can begin to live like a human being." To deflect blame for the fire, Nero found convenient scapegoats in Rome's small Christian community. The persecution that followed was horrific. Christians were arrested, tortured, and subjected to elaborate public executions. Some were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified or burned alive to serve as human torches for Nero's garden parties. Among the victims of this persecution were, according to Christian tradition, the apostles Peter and Paul. As Nero's reign continued, his behavior became increasingly tyrannical. He executed numerous senators and nobles on trumped up charges of treason, confiscating their wealth to fund his extravagant lifestyle. His massive building projects and lavish entertainments drained the treasury. To raise funds, he devalued the currency and imposed heavy taxes on the provinces. The emperor's paranoia reached new heights following the Pisonian conspiracy in the year 65, a plot involving senators, nobles, and even members of the Praetorian Guard. The conspiracy was discovered, and Nero's response was brutal. Among those forced to commit suicide was his former tutor Seneca, along with the poet Lucan and numerous others. The atmosphere in Rome became one of terror, with informants and spies everywhere. In the year 68, the governor of Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex, finally rebelled against Nero's rule. Though Vindex was quickly defeated, his rebellion inspired others. Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Hispania, declared himself emperor and marched on Rome. As support for Nero crumbled, even the Praetorian Guard abandoned him. Facing certain overthrow, Nero fled Rome with only 4 loyal freedmen. The Senate declared him a public enemy and sentenced him to death by beating, a particularly humiliating form of execution. Hiding in a villa outside Rome, Nero prepared for suicide but lacked the courage to take his own life. As he heard the approaching horsemen sent to arrest him, he finally drove a dagger into his throat with the help of his secretary Epaphroditus. Nero's last words were reportedly qualis artifex perio, "What an artist dies in me." Even in death, his narcissism remained undiminished. He was 30 years old and had ruled for 14 years. The death of Nero marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ruled Rome since Augustus. The year following his death, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, saw a succession of civil wars as rival generals fought for power. Eventually, Vespasian established the Flavian dynasty and restored stability to the empire. History has not been kind to Nero, and perhaps deservedly so. His name became synonymous with artistic pretension, cruel persecution, and megalomania. Yet some modern historians argue that the traditional narrative, based largely on hostile senatorial sources, may exaggerate his crimes. They point out that Nero was actually popular among the common people who appreciated his public entertainments and relatively peaceful foreign policy. Regardless of these revisionist views, Nero remains one of history's. In the year 1530, in the Grand Principality of Moscow, a child was born who would transform Russia forever through both remarkable achievements and unspeakable cruelty. His name was Ivan Vasilievich, but history would remember him as Ivan the Terrible, though the Russian word Grozny might better translate as fearsome or formidable. This complex figure would become Russia's first Tsar, expand its territories dramatically, and leave a legacy written in both glory and blood. Ivan's early life was marked by tragedy and instability. His father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died when Ivan was only 3 years old, leaving the child as the nominal ruler of Moscow. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, acted as regent, but died under suspicious circumstances when Ivan was 8, likely poisoned by rival noble families known as boyars. For the next several years, young Ivan lived in an atmosphere of constant danger, intrigue, and neglect. The boyar families fought for control of the government, treating the young prince as little more than a figurehead to be brought out for ceremonies. Ivan later wrote about how these nobles would abuse and humiliate him, stealing from the royal treasury and behaving disrespectfully in his presence. He and his deaf-mute brother Yuri were often hungry and dressed in rags while the boyars feasted on stolen royal provisions. These early experiences instilled in Ivan a deep hatred for the nobility that would manifest in terrible ways during his adult reign. Despite this neglect, Ivan developed a sharp intelligence and an intense interest in reading and religion. He devoured books on history, theology, and military strategy. At age 13, he made his first significant political move by ordering the arrest and execution of Prince Andrei Shwisky, one of the most powerful boyars. According to chronicles, Ivan had his royal dog keepers throw Shwisky to a pack of hungry hunting dogs, a brutal demonstration that the young prince would no longer tolerate disrespect. In 1547, at age 16, Ivan had himself crowned as Tsar of all Russia, the first Russian ruler to officially use this title, derived from Caesar. This ceremony marked Russia's claim to be the successor of the Byzantine Empire, with Moscow as the third Rome. Shortly after his coronation, a great fire destroyed much of Moscow, leading to a rebellion that forced Ivan to flee the city temporarily. Upon his return, he began implementing significant reforms. The early years of Ivan's reign showed great promise. He established the Zemsky Sobor, a form of parliamentary assembly that included representatives from different social classes. He reformed the legal code, reorganized the military, and created Russia's first standing army, known as the Streltsy. He also successfully expanded Russian territory, conquering the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, which gave Russia control of the entire Volga River and opened the way for expansion into Siberia. Ivan commissioned the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow's Red Square to commemorate his victory over Kazan. Legend claims that upon its completion, he ordered the architects blinded so they could never create anything more beautiful, though this story is likely apocryphal. During this period, Ivan also established diplomatic and trade relations with England, corresponding with Queen Elizabeth I and proposing marriage to her at one point. The turning point in Ivan's reign came in 1560 when his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, died suddenly. Ivan was convinced she had been poisoned by the boyars, despite lack of evidence. Her death seemed to unhinge something in the Tsar's mind. His behavior became increasingly erratic and paranoid. He began to see treason and conspiracy everywhere, particularly among the nobility he had always distrusted. In 1564, Ivan suddenly abandoned Moscow with his family and treasury, sending a letter to the Metropolitan, head of the Russian Orthodox Church, announcing his abdication due to the alleged treachery of the boyars and church officials. This theatrical move was calculated to generate panic. The people of Moscow, fearing chaos and foreign invasion without their Tsar, sent delegations begging him to return. Ivan agreed, but only on the condition that he be given absolute power to punish traitors as he saw fit, without interference from the church or nobility. Upon his return, Ivan divided Russia into two parts: the Zemshchina, the land, which would be administered by the traditional government, and the Oprichnina, the separate estate, which would be under his direct personal control. He then created the Oprichniki, a force of 6,000 personal bodyguards and secret police who dressed in black and rode black horses, carrying the emblems of a dog's head and a broom, symbolizing their mission to sniff out treason and sweep it away. What followed was 7 years of terror that gave Ivan his infamous nickname. The Oprichniki were given carte blanche to arrest, torture, and execute anyone suspected of disloyalty. They confiscated estates, murdered entire families, and destroyed whole towns. The city of Novgorod, suspected of plotting with Poland-Lithuania, suffered particularly horrific treatment. In 1570, Ivan personally led his Oprichniki there and supervised 5 weeks of torture and mass executions. Estimates of the death toll range from 3,000 to over 10,000 people. The Novgorod Chronicles report that bodies filled the Volkhov River and that the massacre included drowning women and children. The terror of the Oprichnina extended to the church as well. Metropolitan Philip, who dared to publicly condemn Ivan's actions, was arrested during a church service, dragged out in chains, and later strangled in his monastic cell. Ivan even killed his own cousin, Prince Vladimir of Staritsa, forcing him to drink poison along with his wife and children, then murdering his mother and associates. As Ivan's paranoia deepened, even his closest advisors were not safe. He would often accuse his most loyal servants of treason, subjecting them to torture and execution. The methods of execution became increasingly creative and sadistic. Some victims were boiled alive, others were impaled or flayed. Ivan would often personally participate in torture sessions, taking pleasure in his victims' suffering. The Oprichnina finally ended in 1572, possibly because of its devastating effect on Russia's economy and military capacity. The constant purges had decimated the nobility, disrupted agriculture, and weakened Russia's defenses. When the Crimean Tatars burned Moscow in 1571, the Oprichniki proved ineffective as a military force. Ivan dissolved the organization and even forbade anyone to utter the word Oprichnik under penalty of death. Ivan's personal life was as turbulent as his political reign. After Anastasia's death, he married 6 more times, often discarding or allegedly murdering wives who displeased him. His relationships with his children were equally troubled. In 1581, during an argument, Ivan struck his pregnant daughter-in-law, causing her to miscarry. When his son and heir, also named Ivan, confronted him about this, the Tsar flew into a rage and struck his son on the head with his pointed staff. The younger Ivan died several days later from this wound. The death of his son devastated Ivan. Contemporary accounts describe him howling in grief, banging his head against the floor, and tearing at his beard. He attempted to abdicate again, but was persuaded to remain on the throne. The loss of his capable heir meant that his mentally disabled son, Fyodor, would succeed him, which eventually led to the end of the Rurik dynasty and the time of troubles, a period of chaos and foreign intervention in Russia. Ivan's later years were marked by increasing physical and mental deterioration. He suffered from painful bone disease, possibly syphilis or mercury poisoning from medical treatments. He became obsessed with death and spent hours in prayer, seeking forgiveness for his sins. He compiled lists of his victims and had prayers said for their souls, donating money to monasteries to pray for those he had murdered. Ivan the Terrible died on March 18th, 1584, while playing chess. His last moments were reportedly calm, though legends suggest he died in a fit of rage. His legacy remains deeply controversial. On one hand, he transformed Russia from a medieval principality into a major empire, established important institutions, and patronized art and architecture. On the other hand, his reign of terror resulted in the deaths of thousands, devastated entire regions, and created a tradition of autocratic rule that would influence Russian governance for centuries. Modern historians continue to debate Ivan's character. Some argue that his atrocities have been exaggerated by hostile foreign sources and that his actions were not unusual by the standards of 16th century rulers. Others maintain that his sadistic cruelty and paranoid massacres place him among history's most brutal tyrants. What is certain is that Ivan left an indelible mark on Russian history, earning his sobriquet not through ineffectiveness, but through the terrible effectiveness of his autocratic rule. As your consciousness drifts toward dreams, let the complex figure of Ivan the Terrible fade into the shadows of history. Our next chapter will take us to medieval England, where we'll meet a king whose incompetence and cruelty earned him the contempt of his own people, King John, the monarch who was forced to sign the Magna Carta. But for now, let your mind rest, far from the blood-soaked halls of the Moscow Kremlin. In the year 1166, on Christmas Eve, a prince was born who would earn the dubious distinction of being remembered as England's worst monarch. His name was John, the youngest son of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Unlike his older brothers, who received vast territories as their inheritance, John initially received no lands, earning him the nickname John Lackland. This perceived slight would fuel a lifetime of resentment, paranoia, and ruthless ambition that would ultimately cost him nearly everything. John grew up in the shadow of his more impressive siblings, particularly his brother Richard, who would become known as Richard the Lionheart. While Richard was tall, athletic, and charismatic, John was short, suspicious, and prone to fits of rage. His father, recognizing John's difficult temperament, nevertheless attempted to provide for him by arranging a marriage to the wealthy heiress of Gloucester and granting him lordship over Ireland. However, John's expedition to Ireland in 1185 proved disastrous when he offended the local chiefs by mocking their beards and customs, setting a pattern of diplomatic failures that would mark his entire reign. When John's father died in 1189, the throne passed to Richard, who immediately departed on the Third Crusade. During Richard's absence, John conspired with King Philip II of France to seize power, despite having sworn an oath to support his brother's rule. He declared himself king, seized several castles, and attempted to make deals with Philip to partition Richard's French territories. However, his rebellion collapsed when their mother Eleanor sided with Richard, and John was forced to beg forgiveness when Richard finally returned from captivity in 1194. Remarkably, Richard forgave his treacherous brother, reportedly saying that John was a child who had bad counselors. When Richard died in 1199 from a crossbow wound received while besieging a minor castle, John finally inherited the throne. However, his claim was contested by his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, son of John's deceased older brother, Geoffrey. Many nobles in France preferred Arthur's claim, and war immediately erupted. John initially showed some military competence, capturing Arthur in battle in 1202. However, what followed demonstrated the new king's capacity for cruelty. Arthur disappeared while in John's custody, almost certainly murdered on the king's orders. According to one chronicle, John killed the 16-year-old boy in a drunken rage and threw his body into the Seine River. The murder shocked medieval Europe and turned many of John's French vassals against him. The consequences were catastrophic. King Philip of France summoned John to Paris to answer for Arthur's murder. When John refused to appear, Philip declared all of John's French lands forfeit. In a series of campaigns between 1202 and 1204, John lost Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and parts of Poitou, territories his family had held for generations. The loss of Normandy, in particular, was a devastating blow. John's nickname evolved from Lackland to Soft Sword, mocking his military failures. John's rule in England proved equally disastrous. To fund his wars to recover the lost French territories, he imposed crushing taxes and exploited feudal rights to extract money from his barons. He charged exorbitant fees for inheritances, marriages, and legal cases. Widows were forced to pay huge sums to avoid unwanted remarriages. John also revived forest laws, claiming vast areas of land as royal forests and heavily fining anyone who hunted or gathered wood there without permission. The king's personal behavior scandalized his court. He was notoriously lecherous, pursuing the wives and daughters of his nobles. Several barons rebelled after John allegedly forced himself on their female relatives. He was also famously irreligious in an age of deep faith. Contemporary chroniclers reported that he rarely took communion and was once seen eating and drinking during Mass, showing open contempt for religious ceremonies. John's conflict with the Catholic Church reached a crisis in 1207 when he rejected Pope Innocent III's nominee for Archbishop of Canterbury, instead trying to install his own candidate. The Pope responded by placing England under interdict in 1208, meaning that no religious services could be performed, no marriages, baptisms, or Christian burials. When John retaliated by confiscating church property, the Pope excommunicated him in 1209. For 4 years, England remained under this spiritual siege. John used the opportunity to plunder church revenues, but the interdict deeply disturbed his people, who believed their souls were in danger. Finally, facing the threat of a French invasion blessed by the Pope as a crusade, John capitulated in 1213. In a humiliating ceremony, he surrendered England to the papacy and received it back as a papal fief, agreeing to pay annual tribute to Rome. By 1215, John's tyrannical rule had united virtually all segments of society against him. The barons, supported by the church and the merchants of London, rebelled openly. John's military failures continued when his attempt to reconquer his French lands ended in defeat at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214. Facing a full-scale baronial revolt, John was forced to negotiate. On June 15th, 1215, at Runnymede Meadow near Windsor, John was compelled to attach his seal to Magna Carta, the Great Charter. This document limited royal power and established principles that would echo through centuries of constitutional development. Among its provisions were guarantees that no free man could be imprisoned or punished except by lawful judgment, that the king could not levy taxes without baronial consent, and that justice could not be sold, denied, or delayed. John had no intention of honoring the charter. As soon as the barons dispersed, he appealed to the Pope to annul it, which Innocent did, declaring it illegal and unjust. Civil war erupted again, with the barons now inviting Prince Louis of France to take the English throne. As French forces landed in England and many nobles defected to Louis, John's position became increasingly desperate. In October 1216, while campaigning against the rebels, John's baggage train was caught by the tide while crossing the Wash, an estuary in eastern England. He lost his treasure, including the crown jewels. Already suffering from dysentery, this disaster seemed to break John's spirit. He fell seriously ill and died at Newark Castle on October 18th or 19th, 1216, reportedly after gorging himself on peaches and new cider. John's death at age 48 ended one of the most disastrous reigns in English history. He was succeeded by his 9-year-old son, Henry III. Remarkably, the very barons who had fought so bitterly against John rallied to his young heir, partly because the alternative was French rule under Louis. The regent, William Marshal, reissued a modified version of Magna Carta, which became a cornerstone of English law. History has judged King John harshly, and with good reason. He lost vast territories, murdered his own nephew, alienated the church, and oppressed his subjects to such an extent that they preferred foreign invasion to his continued rule. His reign saw England shrink from a major European power to an isolated kingdom. Yet ironically, John's very failures led to one of history's most important documents. Magna Carta, forced from him at his weakest moment, established principles of limited government and rule of law that would influence democratic development worldwide. As your mind drifts toward sleep, let the turbulent reign of King John fade into the medieval mists. Our next chapter will take us to Eastern Europe, where we'll meet a ruler whose cruelty became legendary, inspiring one of literature's most famous monsters, Vlad the Impaler, the real-life Dracula. But for now, rest peacefully, far from the chaos and misrule of 13th century England. In the year 1431, in the mountain fortress of Sighiswara in Transylvania, a child was born who would inspire one of literature's most enduring monsters. His name was Vlad III, son of Vlad II Dracul, ruler of Wallachia. While the fictional Count Dracula would terrorize victims with supernatural powers, the real Vlad would earn his fearsome reputation through acts of cruelty so extreme that they shocked even his violence-hardened contemporaries. History would remember him as Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler. The name Dracula actually meant son of Dracul or son of the dragon, referring to his father's membership in the Order of the Dragon, a Christian military order dedicated to defending Europe from Ottoman expansion. Young Vlad's early life was shaped by the complex political situation of Eastern Europe, caught between the expanding Ottoman Empire and the Christian kingdoms of Hungary and Poland. When Vlad was around 11 years old, his father made a dangerous political decision. To secure his throne, Vlad II agreed to pay tribute to the Ottoman Sultan and send his two younger sons, Vlad and his brother Radu, as hostages to the Ottoman court. For several years, the boys lived in the Ottoman capital, receiving education in Turkish language, warfare, and court intrigue, but also experiencing the constant threat of death should their father prove disloyal. This period profoundly affected both brothers, though in different ways. Radu, known for his good looks, adapted well to Ottoman court life and eventually converted to Islam, becoming a favorite of the future Sultan Mehmed II. Vlad, however, harbored a deep resentment toward his captors and developed a harsh understanding of power, that it was maintained through fear and demonstrated through spectacular violence. In 1447, while Vlad was still in Ottoman custody, his father and older brother Mircea were assassinated by Wallachian nobles allied with John Hunyadi, the Hungarian regent. The Ottomans, seeing an opportunity to install a friendly ruler, supported 17-year-old Vlad's brief claim to the Wallachian throne. However, this first reign lasted only a few months before Hunyadi drove him out, installing his own candidate. For the next 8 years, Vlad lived in exile, moving between Moldova, Transylvania, and the Ottoman Empire, carefully navigating the complex politics of the region. During this time, he observed how different rulers maintained power and developed his own philosophy of governance through terror. He finally reclaimed his throne in 1456 with Hungarian support, beginning his longest and most infamous reign. Almost immediately upon taking power, Vlad set about eliminating potential threats with ruthless efficiency. He invited hundreds of noble families who had been involved in his father's assassination to an Easter feast at his palace. After wining and dining them, he had his soldiers surround the hall. The older nobles were immediately impaled on stakes outside the city walls. The younger, healthier nobles were marched to the mountains and forced to build his castle at Poenari, working until their fine clothes fell from their bodies and they continued laboring naked. Impalement, Vlad's signature method of execution, was a particularly cruel form of death. Victims were pierced with wooden or metal poles, often through the rectum, and left to die slowly over hours or even days. Vlad refined this punishment into an art form, developing methods to avoid vital organs so victims would suffer longer. He arranged forests of impaled bodies in geometric patterns outside his cities, using the height of the stake to indicate the victim's social rank. Vlad's cruelty extended beyond the nobility. He imposed draconian laws on his subjects, punishing even minor crimes with death. Merchants who cheated their customers were impaled alongside their dishonest waits. Women who committed adultery suffered horrific mutilations. Thieves, regardless of what they stole, faced death. According to one famous story, Vlad placed a golden cup in the central square of Targoviste, his capital, which remained untouched throughout his reign, not because his subjects were inherently honest, but because they were terrified of the consequences. Yet Vlad reserved his greatest cruelty for the Ottoman Turks and those who collaborated with them. When Ottoman envoys refused to remove their turbans in his presence, claiming religious custom, Vlad had their turbans nailed to their heads. When the Sultan sent an army to remove him from power, Vlad conducted a scorched earth campaign, poisoning wells and burning crops. He then launched night raids on the Ottoman camps, using his knowledge of Turkish language and customs to sow confusion and terror. In 1462, Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, personally led a massive army into Wallachia to depose Vlad. As the Ottoman forces approached Targoviste, they encountered a horrifying sight that became known as the Forest of the Impaled. 20,000 Turkish prisoners of war and Muslim civilians lined the road to the capital, all impaled on stakes. The psychological impact was so severe that even Mehmed, who had seen countless battles, was reportedly shaken. Some of his soldiers refused to advance, believing they faced a demon rather than a mortal ruler. Vlad's brutal methods weren't limited to impalement. Historical accounts describe him dining among his dying victims, dipping his bread in their blood. When foreign ambassadors complained about the stench of decomposing bodies, he had them impaled on higher stakes, joking that this would lift them above the smell. When a group of Ottoman prisoners claimed they could not work because of the holy month of Ramadan, Vlad had them all burned alive, stating he was helping them reach heaven faster. Despite his fearsome reputation, Vlad's second reign ended when the Hungarians, his supposed allies, imprisoned him on charges of treason, possibly because his extreme methods were becoming politically inconvenient. He spent 12 years in Hungarian captivity, though in relatively comfortable conditions. During this time, stories circulated that he captured mice and birds in his cell to impale them on tiny sticks, suggesting his bloodthirsty nature remained unchanged. Released in 1474, Vlad briefly regained his throne for a third time in 1476, once again with Hungarian support. However, his final reign lasted only a few months. He died in battle against the Ottomans near Bucharest in December 1476 or January 1477, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. Some accounts say he was killed by his own men, who mistook him for a Turkish soldier. Others claim Ottoman assassins killed him, or that traitorous Wallachian boyars arranged his death. According to legend, Vlad's head was cut off and sent to Constantinople, where the Sultan displayed it on a stake as proof that the impaler had finally been impaled himself. His body was reportedly buried at Snagov Monastery on an island near Bucharest, though later excavations found no human remains in his supposed grave, adding another layer of mystery to his already legendary status. Historical opinions on Vlad remain deeply divided. In Romania, he is often celebrated as a national hero who defended his country and Christian Europe against Ottoman invasion. Romanian folklore portrays him as a harsh but just ruler who protected the common people while punishing corrupt nobles and dishonest merchants. However, contemporary German pamphlets, which form much of the historical record, depict him as a sadistic monster who killed for pleasure. Modern historians estimate that Vlad was responsible for the deaths of between 40,000 and 100,000 people during his lifetime, astronomical numbers for a ruler of a small principality in the 15th century. While some of his cruelty can be contextualized within the violent standards of his time and region, his particular enthusiasm for torture and the theatrical nature of his punishments set him apart from his contemporaries. Vlad's transformation into the fictional Count Dracula began in 1897 when Irish author Bram Stoker published his famous novel. Stoker borrowed the name Dracula and the Transylvanian setting, but created an entirely different kind of monster. The historical Vlad drank blood metaphorically through his violent rule. Stoker's creation did so literally as a vampire. Yet both figures represent a similar kind of fear, the terror of a predator who sees other humans as mere resources to be consumed. As you drift toward sleep, let the complex figure of Vlad the Impaler fade into the mists of history. In our next chapter, we'll return to ancient Rome to meet another emperor whose descent into tyranny shocked the empire, Commodus, the emperor who preferred the gladiatorial arena to the throne room. But for now, rest peacefully, far from the forests of the impaled and the blood-soaked castles of medieval Wallachia. In the year 161, in the imperial palace of Rome, a son was born to one of history's wisest rulers, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor. This child, named Lucius Aurelius Commodus, would grow up to become the complete opposite of his thoughtful father, plunging Rome into an era of decadence, violence, and megalomania that would mark the beginning of the empire's decline. History would remember Commodus not as the heir to philosophical wisdom, but as the emperor who confused governance with gladiatorial games and reality with delusion. Unlike his father, who spent his youth studying philosophy and preparing for leadership, Commodus showed little interest in intellectual pursuits. He was the first emperor since Vespasian to be born in the purple, born while his father was already emperor, which gave him an inflated sense of divine entitlement from childhood. While Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations on duty and virtue, young Commodus was more interested in physical activities, particularly hunting and combat sports. Commodus became co-emperor with his father at age 15 in 177, an unusually young age even by Roman standards. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180, possibly from plague while campaigning against Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier, 18-year-old Commodus became sole ruler of the Roman Empire. His first act as emperor revealed his priorities. Rather than continuing his father's military campaigns to secure the northern borders, he quickly negotiated a peace treaty with the Germanic tribes and hurried back to Rome to enjoy the pleasures of the capital. The young emperor's return to Rome marked the beginning of what historians call the Reign of Blood and Games. Commodus had no interest in the tedious work of administration, preferring to delegate governmental duties to a series of favorites while he pursued his obsession with gladiatorial combat and other blood sports. He appointed his childhood friend, Seodorus, as his chamberlain, followed by a freedman named Cleander, who effectively ran the empire while Commodus indulged his fantasies. Commodus developed an obsession with gladiatorial games that went far beyond the normal Roman appreciation for such spectacles. He didn't just sponsor games, he actively participated in them. The Emperor of Rome, descended from the great Antonine dynasty, began appearing in the arena dressed as a gladiator, fighting against professional fighters and wild animals. While these contests were carefully staged to ensure the emperor always won, they scandalized Roman society. Senators were forced to attend and cheer, while their emperor, whom they were supposed to regard as a semi-divine figure, performed like a common entertainer. The emperor's participation in the games became increasingly elaborate and delusional. He identified himself with Hercules, appearing in public wearing a lion's skin and carrying a club. He ordered statues of himself depicted as Hercules to be erected throughout the empire. In the arena, he would fight exotic animals imported from across the empire, lions from Africa, tigers from Asia, elephants from India. Historical records claim he personally killed 100 lions in a single day, shooting them with arrows from a protected platform. As Commodus's megalomania grew, so did his paranoia and cruelty. He ordered the execution of numerous senators on trumped-up charges of conspiracy, often confiscating their wealth to fund his extravagant lifestyle and constant games. He renamed the months of the year after his own names and titles, changed the name of Rome to Colonia Commodiana, colony of Commodus, and even declared that the Roman people should be called commodiani. He ordered the heads removed from statues of gods throughout Rome and replaced with his own likeness. The emperor's delusions reached their peak when he began to believe he truly was the reincarnation of Hercules. He planned to inaugurate the year 193 by appearing as a consul not in traditional robes, but in gladiator's armor, and to kill both human opponents and wild beasts in the arena. He intended to then declare himself the founder of a new Rome, having the city officially renamed after himself. The Roman Senate, already horrified by his behavior, was expected to participate in this farce. Commodus's rule was marked by administrative corruption on an unprecedented scale. His freedman Cleander sold public offices to the highest bidder, including senatorial positions, military commands, and even suffect consulships. When a food shortage led to riots in Rome, the people blamed Cleander's corruption. To save himself, Commodus had his own favorite executed and his head thrown to the mob. This pattern repeated several times, with different favorites being sacrificed to appease public anger, while the emperor continued his excesses. The emperor's cruelty extended beyond political executions. He took sadistic pleasure in demonstrating his power over life and death. During gladiatorial games, he would order that defeated fighters be finished off in increasingly cruel ways. He once ordered that all the wounded from several days of games be brought into the arena, where he personally finished them off, claiming he was performing a public service by eliminating the weak. As Commodus became more unhinged, he surrounded himself with athletes, actors, and gladiators rather than senators and administrators. He elevated his wrestling partners and chariot drivers to positions of power, creating a bizarre court where traditional Roman values were completely inverted. The imperial palace became a place of constant parties, orgies, and violent entertainments. The end of Commodus's reign came through a conspiracy involving those closest to him. His mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Latus discovered their names on one of the emperor's execution lists. Realizing their lives were in danger, they decided to act first. On December 31st, 192, Marcia attempted to poison Commodus. When the poison only made him sick and he went to take a bath to recover, they sent in his wrestling partner, a man named Narcissus, to strangle him to death. The circumstances of his death were particularly fitting. The emperor, who had degraded himself by fighting as a gladiator, was ultimately killed by a professional athlete. He died at age 31, having ruled for 12 years. The Senate, which had suffered under his tyranny, immediately declared him a public enemy and ordered his statues destroyed and his name erased from public monuments, the formal damnatio memoriae reserved for the worst rulers. Commodus's death marked the end of the Antonine dynasty and the beginning of a period of civil war known as the Year of the Five Emperors. His rule had so damaged the prestige of the imperial office that multiple generals could now claim the throne by force. The eventual victor, Septimius Severus, would establish a new dynasty based more explicitly on military power rather than senatorial consensus. The reign of Commodus represents a turning point in Roman history. Under the five good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, the empire had enjoyed nearly a century of prosperity and good governance. The principle of adoption, or where each emperor chose his most capable successor, had produced a series of competent rulers. Commodus, as Marcus Aurelius's biological son, broke this pattern, demonstrating the dangers of hereditary succession in an autocratic system. While Commodus's immediate predecessors had embodied the Roman ideal of the philosopher king, he represented its complete antithesis. Where Marcus Aurelius had written, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one," his son seemed to follow the principle, "Waste no time being what an emperor should be whatever brings you pleasure." His obsession with gladiatorial games reflected not just personal decadence, but a fundamental misunderstanding of his role as emperor. Modern historians debate whether Commodus was truly insane or simply the product of unlimited power and a pampered upbringing. Unlike his father, who had been carefully educated and gradually introduced to the responsibilities of power, Commodus had been indulged from birth. His behavior patterns, the megalomania, the need for constant adulation, the identification with divine figures, suggest what psychologists might now recognize as narcissistic personality disorder enhanced by absolute power. The reign of Commodus had long-lasting effects on the Roman Empire. He bankrupted the treasury with his constant games and spectacles, debased the currency to fund his lifestyle, and destroyed the careful balance between emperor and senate that had characterized the Antonine period. The chaos that followed his death would set the pattern for the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire nearly collapsed under pressure from external invasions and internal civil wars. Perhaps most significantly, Commodus transformed the nature of imperial power in Rome. Previous emperors, even the bad ones like Nero and Caligula, had maintained some pretense of being first among equals with the Senate. Commodus openly embraced divine monarchy, setting a precedent for the more autocratic style of rule that would characterize the later empire. His reign marked the point where the emperor truly became a god-king rather than a constitutional monarch. The story of Commodus serves as a cautionary tale about the corruption of power and the dangers of hereditary rule without proper preparation. It shows how quickly good governance can collapse when leadership falls into the wrong hands, and how the wisdom of one generation can be squandered by the folly of the next. As you drift toward sleep, let the cautionary tale of Commodus fade into history. In our next chapter, we'll journey to 19th century Belgium to meet a king whose colonial rule in Africa resulted in suffering on an almost unimaginable scale, Leopold II. But for now, rest peacefully, far from the blood-soaked sands of the Colosseum and the delusional grandeur of imperial Rome. In the year 1835, in the royal palace of Brussels, a prince was born who would orchestrate one of history's greatest humanitarian disasters. His name was Leopold Louis-Philippe Marie Victor, and he would become Leopold II, King of the Belgians. While he ruled his small European kingdom as a constitutional monarch, his personal control over the Congo Free State in Africa resulted in the deaths of millions, earning him a place among history's most ruthless rulers. Leopold grew up in a newly independent Belgium, a country created only 5 years before his birth. His father, Leopold I, was a German prince who had been chosen as Belgium's first king. Young Leopold was educated in the manner of European royalty, studying languages, military science, and statecraft. However, he developed an obsession that would define his life and lead to untold suffering: the desire for colonial possessions. Belgium was a small, neutral country surrounded by powerful neighbors. Its constitution limited royal power, frustrating Leopold's ambitions for personal glory and wealth. While other European powers were building vast colonial empires, Belgium showed little interest in overseas expansion. Leopold complained that Belgium was a small country with small people, and he was determined to acquire a colony that would bring him both wealth and international prestige. When Leopold became king in 1865, he immediately began seeking colonial opportunities. He attempted to purchase territories in Asia, considered leasing the Philippines from Spain, and explored possibilities in Africa. His efforts were repeatedly blocked by the Belgian parliament, which saw no benefit in costly colonial adventures. Frustrated but undeterred, Leopold developed a new strategy. He would acquire a colony not for Belgium, but for himself personally. The opportunity came with the exploration of Central Africa. In the 1870s, much of the African interior remained unknown to Europeans. The Welsh-American explorer Henry Morton Stanley had recently completed his famous journey down the Congo River, revealing a vast territory rich in natural resources. Leopold saw his chance. He created a supposedly humanitarian organization called the International African Association, presenting himself as a philanthropist interested in bringing civilization and Christianity to Africa. In 1876, Leopold hosted the Brussels Geographic Conference, gathering explorers, geographers, and humanitarian leaders. He spoke eloquently about ending the slave trade and bringing progress to Africa. His true intentions, revealed in private letters, were very different. He wrote, "I do not want to miss a good chance of getting us a slice of this magnificent African cake." Leopold's public humanitarian facade masked a ruthless plan for personal enrichment. Leopold hired Stanley to return to the Congo and establish trading posts along the river. Stanley signed hundreds of treaties with local chiefs who, unable to read European languages, unknowingly signed away their land and sovereignty. These treaties formed the legal basis for Leopold's claim to the region. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European powers divided Africa among themselves, Leopold successfully lobbied for personal control of the Congo Basin, an area 76 times larger than Belgium. The conference granted Leopold sovereignty over the Congo Free State as his personal property, not as a Belgian colony. This arrangement was unprecedented in colonial history. The other European powers agreed partly because they believed Leopold's humanitarian rhetoric, and partly because they preferred a weak Belgian king controlling the region rather than a rival power. Leopold promised to maintain free trade, suppress slavery, and protect native rights. He would violate all these promises. Once in control, Leopold transformed the Congo into a vast forced labor camp. His first target was ivory, sending agents up the Congo River to establish trading posts and extract as much ivory as possible. But the real profits came with the invention of the inflatable bicycle tire and the growing automobile industry, which created massive demand for rubber. The Congo's rainforests were rich in wild rubber vines, and Leopold was determined to extract every ounce of profit from them. Leopold established a system of exploitation that shocked even the colonial standards of the time. He created the Force Publique, a private army of European officers commanding African soldiers to enforce rubber quotas. Villages were required to provide specified amounts of rubber, ivory, and food. Those who failed to meet quotas faced brutal punishment. The force publique would hold women and children hostage until men brought in their quota of rubber. To ensure soldiers didn't waste ammunition on hunting, they were required to provide the severed hand of a victim for each bullet used. This led to a grotesque trade in human hands. Soldiers would sometimes cut off hands from living people to account for ammunition used in hunting or lost in skirmishes. Baskets of severed hands became a symbol of Leopold's reign of terror. The methods of rubber collection were themselves deadly. Villagers had to venture deep into the forest, often for days, to find rubber vines. They would make incisions in the vines and let the sap run over their bodies, then painfully peel it off their skin once it dried. With men forced to gather rubber, villages couldn't produce enough food, leading to widespread famine. Disease spread rapidly through weakened populations. Leopold never set foot in the Congo, ruling his private empire from his palaces in Belgium. He created a web of concession companies, granting them monopolies over vast territories in exchange for a share of profits. These companies, driven purely by profit, often exceeded even Leopold's brutal standards in their treatment of the Congolese people. Entire regions were depopulated as people fled into the forest or died from overwork, starvation, and disease. The profits from this system were enormous. Leopold used his Congo wealth to fund massive building projects in Belgium, including palaces, public buildings, and urban renovations. He became one of the richest men in Europe, all from the forced labor and suffering of millions. The Belgian people benefited from these projects, but most remained unaware of their true cost in human lives. Reports of atrocities began to reach Europe through missionaries and travelers. Edmund Morel, a British shipping clerk, noticed that ships leaving for the Congo carried only guns and ammunition, while returning ships brought valuable rubber and ivory. He deduced that no normal trade was occurring, only violent extraction. Morel began a campaign to expose Leopold's crimes, founding the Congo Reform Association. Missionaries provided photographic evidence of mutilations and testimony about mass killings. One missionary, John Harris, photographed a father staring at the severed hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter, killed as punishment for his village's failure to meet rubber quotas. These images, published in newspapers and magazines, shocked the Western world. The international outcry grew. Mark Twain wrote a satirical pamphlet titled King Leopold's Soliloquy, while Arthur Conan Doyle published The Crime of the Congo. Joseph Conrad's novel, Heart of Darkness, though fictionalized, was inspired by the horrors of Leopold's Congo. Even other colonial powers, hardly paragons of humanitarian rule, condemned Leopold's methods as excessive. Under mounting pressure, Leopold established a commission of inquiry in 1904. Despite attempts to control its findings, the commission confirmed widespread atrocities. The international campaign against Leopold intensified, with public meetings, newspaper exposés, and diplomatic pressure. By 1908, Leopold was forced to relinquish control of the Congo to the Belgian state, though he received substantial compensation for his property. Estimating the death toll under Leopold's rule is difficult due to lack of reliable census data. Historians generally agree that the population of the Congo declined by several million during his 23-year reign. Some estimates range from 5 to 10 million deaths, though others suggest even higher numbers. These deaths resulted from murder, starvation, exhaustion, disease, and plummeting birth rates due to family separation. Leopold died in 1909, 1 year after losing control of the Congo. He spent his final years attempting to destroy evidence of his crimes, burning archives of the Congo Free State. On his deathbed, he reportedly expressed no remorse, maintaining that he had brought civilization to Africa. He was buried in the royal crypt at Laeken, where his tomb remains to this day. The Belgian government continued to rule the Congo until independence in 1960, but the colonial administration, while still exploitative, never matched the extreme brutality of Leopold's personal rule. The psychological and social trauma of Leopold's reign contributed to the Congo's post-independence struggles, as traditional social structures had been destroyed and entire generations traumatized. Leopold's rule in the Congo represents one of the worst examples of colonial exploitation. While other colonial powers committed numerous atrocities, the Congo Free State was unique in being the personal property of one man, run purely for profit, with no oversight or accountability. Leopold's combination of public humanitarian rhetoric with private brutality created a template for 20th century dictators who would similarly mask their crimes behind progressive language. The story of Leopold in the Congo challenges comfortable narratives about the civilizing mission of colonialism. It reveals how humanitarian language can mask the most inhumane practices and how international respectability can coexist with mass murder. Leopold was not a madman or a primitive warrior, but an educated European monarch who attended operas, collected art, and built beautiful buildings, all funded by unimaginable human suffering. Today, Leopold remains a controversial figure in Belgium. Some of his statues have been removed or vandalized, while others still stand. The Royal Museum for Central Africa, built with Congo profits, has been renovated to acknowledge colonial crimes. Yet full reckoning with Leopold's legacy remains incomplete as Belgium and the world continue to grapple with the long shadows of colonialism. As your mind drifts toward rest, let the troubling story of Leopold II fade into the darkness. In our next chapter, we'll move to the 20th century to examine a revolutionary whose utopian vision led to one of history's most horrific genocides, Pol Pot of Cambodia. But for now, sleep peacefully, far from the rubber forests of the Congo and the gilded palaces built on human misery. In the year 1925, in the small village of Prek Spauv in French colonial Cambodia, a boy was born who would orchestrate one of the 20th century's most devastating genocides. His birth name was Saloth Tsar, though the world would come to know him by his revolutionary alias, Pol Pot. Under his leadership, the Khmer Rouge would transform Cambodia into a vast concentration camp, resulting in the deaths of nearly a quarter of the country's population in less than 4 years. Young Saloth Tsar grew up in relatively privileged circumstances. His family had royal connections. His cousin was a consort to the Cambodian king, and his sister was a royal ballet dancer. This connection allowed him to attend elite schools in Phnom Penh, where he proved to be an unremarkable student. In 1949, he received a scholarship to study radio electronics in Paris, joining a small community of Cambodian students in the French capital. Paris in the post-war years was a hotbed of radical politics, and it was here that Saloth Tsar was introduced to Marxism. He joined the French Communist Party and a group of Cambodian students who formed the Marxist Circle. However, he spent more time on political activities than his studies, eventually losing his scholarship and returning to Cambodia in 1953 without a degree. This academic failure would later fuel his deep resentment toward intellectuals. Back in Cambodia, Saloth Tsar became a teacher while secretly organizing communist activities. He joined the Indochinese Communist Party and gradually rose through its ranks. In 1960, he participated in founding the Workers' Party of Kampuchea, which would later become the Communist Party of Kampuchea, better known as the Khmer Rouge. By 1963, he had become the party's leader, adopting the pseudonym Pol Pot, which he claimed meant original Cambodian. Throughout the 1960s, Pol Pot built his revolutionary movement in the Cambodian jungle. He developed an extreme interpretation of Marxism that went beyond even Mao's Cultural Revolution. Pol Pot envisioned a complete transformation of Cambodian society, a return to an agrarian utopia free from foreign influence, urban corruption, and class distinctions. His ideology combined communism with extreme Khmer nationalism and a romanticized view of peasant life. The Vietnam War provided the opportunity Pol Pot needed. As American bombing campaigns destabilized Cambodia and Prince Sihanouk's government weakened, the Khmer Rouge gained support among peasants affected by the bombing. When General Lon Nol overthrew Sihanouk in 1970, the prince allied himself with the Khmer Rouge from exile, giving the movement legitimacy. After 5 years of civil war, the Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom Penh on April 17, 1975. What followed was one of the most radical social experiments in human history. Within days of taking power, the Khmer Rouge ordered the complete evacuation of Phnom Penh and other cities. Over 2 million people were forced to march into the countryside, including hospital patients still attached to IV drips. Thousands died during these forced evacuations. The Khmer Rouge told people the evacuation was temporary, necessary to avoid American bombing, but it was actually the first step in Pol Pot's plan to create his agrarian utopia. Pol Pot declared 1975, year zero, signifying a complete break with the past. Money, private property, religion, and traditional culture were abolished. Schools, hospitals, factories, and monasteries were closed. Books were burned except for technical manuals about farming. Families were separated, with children taken from parents to be raised by the state. Even wearing glasses could mark someone as an intellectual and laid to execution. The entire population was forced into agricultural communes, working 12 to 14 hours a day with minimal food. The Khmer Rouge's slogan was, "To keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss." People were classified as either base people, peasants with good revolutionary credentials, or new people, urban evacuees considered tainted by foreign influence. New people faced especially harsh treatment and were often worked to death. Pol Pot's paranoia led to increasingly violent purges. The Khmer Rouge established a network of prisons, the most notorious being S-21, also known as Tuol Sleng, in Phnom Penh. Of the estimated 14,000 to 20,000 prisoners who passed through Ik S-21, only 12 are known to have survived. Prisoners were tortured into confessing to impossible crimes, being CIA agents, having bourgeois thoughts, or sabotaging the revolution. Their confessions implicated others, creating an ever-expanding cycle of arrests. The killing fields, sites where victims were executed and buried in mass graves, dotted the countryside. To save bullets, executioners often used farm tools, clubs, or sharpened bamboo sticks. Infants were killed by smashing their heads against trees. The Khmer Rouge had a saying, "To dig up the grass, one must also dig up the roots," meaning that entire families had to be eliminated to prevent revenge. Starvation became widespread as Pol Pot's agricultural policies failed catastrophically. Despite fertile land, Cambodia couldn't produce enough rice to feed its population. The Khmer Rouge exported rice to China in exchange for weapons, while Cambodians starved. Untrained city dwellers couldn't farm effectively. Irrigation projects built without engineering knowledge failed, and the elimination of experienced farmers worsened the crisis. Hundreds of thousands died from starvation and disease. Even within the Khmer Rouge, no one was safe from Pol Pot's paranoia. He ordered purges of his own cadres, particularly those from the Eastern Zone, who he suspected of collaborating with Vietnam. Entire units were executed. Ta Mok, known as the Butcher, carried out many of these internal purges. The revolution began devouring its own children. Pol Pot's regime might have lasted longer if not for his miscalculation regarding Vietnam. Border clashes escalated as the Khmer Rouge attacked Vietnamese villages, massacring civilians. In December 1978, Vietnam invaded Cambodia with a force of over 100,000 troops. The Khmer Rouge army, weakened by purges and poor leadership, collapsed quickly. Phnom Penh fell on January 7th, 1979, ending Pol Pot's rule after 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days. The Vietnamese installed a new government led by Khmer Rouge defectors, including Hun Sen, who would dominate Cambodian politics for decades. Pol Pot and the remaining Khmer Rouge leadership fled to the Thai border, where they continued guerrilla warfare with support from China and, controversially, the United States, which opposed Vietnamese expansion. The United Nations continued to recognize the Khmer Rouge as Cambodia's legitimate government until 1991. Pol Pot lived in relative comfort in jungle camps for nearly 2 more decades. He never faced justice for his crimes. In 1997, after ordering the murder of his defense minister, Sun Sen, and his family, Pol Pot was placed under house arrest by Ta Mok. On April 15, 1998, as plans were being made to hand him over to an international tribunal, Pol Pot died in his sleep. The official cause was heart failure, though some suspected suicide or murder. The death toll under the Khmer Rouge is estimated between 1.7 and 2.2 million people, nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population. Victims died from execution, starvation, disease, and overwork. The country lost most of its educated population: teachers, doctors, engineers, and artists. Traditional culture was devastated. A generation grew up without formal education, and Cambodia remains one of the poorest countries in Southeast Asia. The extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, established in 2006, has convicted only a handful of senior Khmer Rouge leaders. Many perpetrators integrated back into society or died before facing justice. The psychological trauma affects multiple generations. Many Cambodians suffer from what psychiatrists call backspat, a cultural syndrome similar to PTSD. Pol Pot's regime represents the extreme endpoint of utopian ideology combined with total power. His vision of a pure, self-sufficient agrarian society led to one of the fastest genocides in history. Unlike the Holocaust or Rwanda genocide, which targeted specific ethnic groups, the Khmer Rouge killed their own people based on class, education, and perceived political reliability. It was auto-genocide, a society destroying itself. What makes Pol Pot particularly chilling is his apparent belief in his own righteousness. Even in his final interview in 1997, he showed no remorse, claiming his conscience was clear. He maintained that his intentions were good, to create an independent Cambodia free from exploitation. This disconnect between noble intentions and horrific results serves as a warning about the dangers of radical ideology unchecked by humanity. As you drift towards sleep, let the dark chapter of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge fade into history. In our next segment, we'll examine another African dictator whose bizarre behavior and brutal rule terrorized Uganda, Idi Amin. But for now, rest peacefully, far from the killing fields of Cambodia and the tragic consequences of utopian dreams turned into nightmares. In the year 1925, in the small village of Koboko in northwestern Uganda, a child was born who would become one of Africa's most notorious dictators. His name was Idi Amin Dada Omi, and his 8-year rule over Uganda would be marked by bizarre behavior, brutal repression, and economic catastrophe. While the exact number of his victims remains disputed, estimates range from 100,000 to 500,000 deaths, earning him the grim nickname, the Butcher of Uganda. Amin's early life remains shrouded in mystery and contradiction, partly due to his own fabrications. Born into the Kakwa ethnic group, he received little formal education, later claiming to have had only a 4th-grade education. His father, a Muslim, abandoned the family when Amin was young, leaving him to be raised by his mother, who earned money as a traditional healer and herbalist. As a child, Amin was notably tall and physically imposing, traits that would serve him well in his military career. In 1946, Amin joined the King's African Rifles, a British colonial regiment, as a cook. His impressive physical stature, he stood at 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed over 250 pounds, quickly caught the attention of his British officers. He excelled in sports, particularly boxing, swimming, and rugby, becoming the Ugandan light heavyweight boxing champion and holding that title for 9 consecutive years. During the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya in the 1950s, Amin served with the British forces. His willingness to carry out brutal interrogations and his loyalty to his British superiors earned him rapid promotions. By Ugandan independence in 1962, Amin had become one of only 2 African officers in the entire Ugandan military, achieving the rank of major. His lack of formal education actually worked to his advantage, as British colonial officers preferred promoting Africans they believed would be easier to control. Amin's rise continued under Uganda's first Prime Minister and later President, Milton Obote. He was promoted to colonel in 1964 and then Major General in 1968, becoming commander of the Ugandan Armed Forces. During this period, Amin developed a network of supporters within the military, particularly among soldiers from West Nile and Sudan. He also established connections with Israeli military advisors who were training the Ugandan army. The relationship between Obote and Amin began to deteriorate in the late 1960s. Obote grew suspicious of Amin's loyalty and his involvement in gold and ivory smuggling operations. When a boat left for a Commonwealth conference in Singapore in January 1971, Amin saw his opportunity. On January 25th, 1971, he staged a military coup, seizing control of the government while Obote was abroad. Initially, Amin's coup was welcomed by many Ugandans and the international community. Obote's government had become increasingly authoritarian, and Amin promised to restore democracy and hold free elections. Western nations, particularly Britain and Israel, saw Amin as a useful ally against the spread of socialism in Africa. The Israeli government, in particular, viewed Amin as a counterweight to pro-Arab leaders in the region. However, the honeymoon period was short-lived. Within weeks of taking power, Amin began eliminating potential rivals. He ordered the execution of military officers and government officials loyal to Obote, many of whom were from the Acholi and Langi ethnic groups. Bodies began appearing in lakes and forests around Uganda. The killings were often carried out by three notorious organizations: the State Research Bureau, the Public Safety Unit, and military police. Amin's rule became increasingly erratic and violent. He declared himself president for life, promoted himself to field marshal, and later added the title Conqueror of the British Empire. In a famous incident, he sent a telegram to Queen Elizabeth II stating, "I want to assure you that I am ready to receive you at any time if you would like to come to Uganda to see how we manage our affairs. If you come, you will see for yourself that I am not an evil man, as the British press wants the world to believe." One of Amin's most catastrophic decisions came in 1972 when he announced that God had spoken to him in a dream, instructing him to expel all Asians from Uganda. He gave the country's 80,000 Asian residents, many of whom had lived in Uganda for generations, just 90 days to leave. These Asians, who controlled much of Uganda's economy, commerce, and manufacturing sectors, were forced to abandon their businesses and property. The expulsion devastated Uganda's economy as Amin redistributed the abandoned businesses to his supporters, most of whom had no business experience. Amin's behavior became increasingly bizarre. He claimed to be the uncrowned King of Scotland and offered to be King of England if asked. He awarded himself numerous medals, including a Victoria Cross, and declared himself the conqueror of the British Empire. He publicly praised Adolf Hitler for killing Jews and announced plans to erect a statue honoring Hitler in Kampala. After a diplomatic break with Israel, Amin converted to radical Islam and became a vocal supporter of Palestinian causes. The State Research Bureau, headed by Amin's trusted associates, became a feared instrument of repression. Its headquarters in Nakasero became notorious for torture and executions. Victims included politicians, religious leaders, journalists, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens suspected of disloyalty. Methods of killing included beating victims to death with hammers, feeding them to crocodiles, or simply shooting them and dumping their bodies in the Nile River. Amin maintained power through a combination of brutality and unpredictability. He would often invite potential opponents to dinner, treat them lavishly, and then have them executed afterward. In one notorious incident, he allegedly kept the severed heads of political opponents in his refrigerator. While some of these stories may be exaggerated, they contributed to a climate of terror that kept the population subdued. The economy under Amin collapsed dramatically. The expulsion of Asian business people, combined with Amin's economic mismanagement, led to severe shortages of basic goods. Inflation skyrocketed, reaching 400% by 1978. Agricultural production declined as farmers fled violence in rural areas. The tourism industry, once a major source of foreign exchange, disappeared entirely. Amin attempted to solve these problems by printing more money, which only worsened inflation. Amin's foreign policy was equally erratic. He broke relations with Israel and Britain, aligning himself with Libya's Muammar Gaddafi and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. In 1976, he allowed Palestinian hijackers to land a plane with Israeli hostages at Entebbe Airport. The subsequent Israeli rescue operation, known as Operation Entebbe, was a humiliating defeat for Amin, who lost soldiers and military equipment in the raid. The beginning of the end came in 1978 when Amin ordered an invasion of Tanzania, claiming a portion of Tanzanian territory. Tanzania's president, Julius Nyerere, who had been sheltering Ugandan exiles, responded with a counter-invasion. The Tanzanian army, supported by Ugandan exile forces, advanced rapidly toward Kampala. Amin's demoralized army offered little resistance. As Tanzanian forces approached Kampala in April 1979, Amin fled first to Libya and then to Saudi Arabia, where he was granted asylum. The Saudi government provided him with a comfortable exile in exchange for his promise to stay out of politics. He lived in Jeddah with several of his wives and children, reportedly receiving a generous monthly stipend from the Saudi government. Amin spent his exile years in relative luxury, shopping at expensive stores, swimming at private beaches, and occasionally giving interviews to journalists. He never expressed remorse for his actions, continuing to insist that his rule had been beneficial for Uganda. He died on August 16, 2003, at King Faisal Specialist Hospital in Jeddah, reportedly from kidney failure. He was buried in Saudi Arabia without any official ceremony. The legacy of Amin's rule continues to haunt Uganda. Beyond the hundreds of thousands of deaths, his regime destroyed the country's economy, educational system, and social fabric. The expulsion of the Asian community removed much of Uganda's professional and business class. The culture of violence and impunity he established influenced subsequent Ugandan politics. Amin represents a particular type of post-colonial African dictator, charming to foreigners, brutal to his own people, and skilled at exploiting ethnic and religious divisions. His ability to maintain power for 8 years, despite his obvious instability, demonstrates how international politics, ethnic tensions, and sheer terror can sustain even the most incompetent rulers. What makes Amin particularly disturbing is the combination of buffoonery and brutality. His outlandish statements and bizarre behavior often masked the systematic violence of his regime. While the world laughed at his eccentricities, hundreds of thousands of Ugandans lived in terror or died at the hands of his security forces. Modern psychological analysis suggests Amin may have suffered from mental illness, possibly exacerbated by untreated syphilis. However, his cruelty was calculated and his political instincts sharp enough to maintain power for nearly a decade. His rule serves as a reminder that evil can wear many faces and that international indifference can enable atrocities. As you drift toward sleep, let the story of Idi Amin fade into history. In our next chapter, we'll travel back to ancient times to meet perhaps the most feared warlord in history, Attila the Hun, whose very name became synonymous with barbarism and destruction. But for now, rest peacefully, far from the terror that once gripped Uganda under one of Africa's most notorious dictators. In the year 937, in Rome's powerful aristocratic circles, a child was born who would become perhaps the most scandalous leader in Catholic Church history. His given name was Octavian, son of Alberic II, the self-styled Prince of Rome. At the unprecedented age of 18, this young man would ascend to the papal throne as Pope John XII, transforming the Vatican into what many contemporaries described as a den of debauchery and corruption. Octavian was born into extraordinary privilege and power. His father, Alberic II, had established himself as the secular ruler of Rome, effectively controlling the papacy for 2 decades. His grandmother was the infamous Marozia, who had allegedly been the mistress of Pope Sergius III and mother of Pope John XI. This period of church history, later dubbed the pornocracy, or rule of the harlots, saw the papacy controlled by a powerful Roman family, more interested in political power than spiritual matters. As Alberic lay dying in 954, he made the Roman nobility swear an oath that they would elect his son Octavian as the next pope when the current pontiff died. This arrangement was unprecedented. Never before had the papacy been promised to someone as a hereditary right. When Pope Agapetus II died in 955, the Romans honored their oath, and 18-year-old Octavian became Pope John XII, making him the youngest pope in history and one of the few to change his name upon election. The new pope immediately demonstrated that his interests lay far from spiritual matters. Contemporary chroniclers, including Bishop Luitprand of Cremona, described John XII's papal court as resembling more a brothel than a religious institution. The young pope openly kept mistresses in the Lateran palace, allegedly turning this sacred residence into his personal harem. He was accused of committing adultery with numerous married women, including his own father's concubine, and even supposedly violated female pilgrims who came to Rome seeking blessing. John XII's sexual escapades were matched by his violence and cruelty. He allegedly blinded his confessor, castrated and murdered a cardinal, and killed another cardinal by throwing him into a fire. According to the Liber Pontificalis, a book recording the lives of popes, John was accused of turning the Lateran palace into a brothel and conducting affairs with widows and maidens, even with his own niece. The sacred palace became the scene of dice games, drinking parties, and occult ceremonies where the pope allegedly toasted to pagan gods. The young pope's governance was as disastrous as his personal conduct. He sold church offices to the highest bidder, a practice known as simony, and even ordained bishops and deacons in exchange for payment, including one instance where he ordained a 10-year-old boy as a bishop. He spent much of the church treasury on gambling, lavish banquets, and gifts for his numerous lovers. The spiritual authority of the papacy reached perhaps its lowest point in history under his leadership. Despite his depravity, John XII possessed some political acumen. Recognizing that the papal states were threatened by various Italian princes, he sought protection from Otto I, King of Germany. In 962, John crowned Otto as Holy Roman Emperor, reviving the imperial title in Western Europe for the first time since Charlemagne. This alliance temporarily secured John's political position, but it would soon backfire spectacularly. After Otto left Rome to campaign in southern Italy, John began negotiating with the emperor's enemies, including Adalbert, son of the former king of Italy, and even sent envoys to the Byzantine Empire. When Otto learned of this betrayal, he marched back to Rome. John fled the city, taking the papal treasury with him. Otto convened a synod of bishops to address the pope's conduct. The synod that followed in 963 was extraordinary. Bishops presented a long list of charges against John XII, including murder, arson, adultery, incest, and invocation of pagan gods. According to historical records, the charges included celebrating Mass without taking communion, ordaining a deacon in a stable, turning the papal palace into a brothel, castrating and killing subordinates, and invoking Jupiter and Venus while gambling. When asked to respond to these charges, John XII sent a message that captures his contempt for church authority. "We have heard that you intend to elect another pope. If you do, I excommunicate you by Almighty God, so that you are not permitted to ordain anyone or celebrate Mass." The synod proceeded anyway, deposing John and electing a new pope, Leo VIII. When Otto left Rome again, John returned with an army and drove out Leo VIII. He then held his own synod, which excommunicated all who had participated in his deposition and brutally punished those who had opposed him. One cardinal had his nose and tongue cut off, while another had his hand severed. The violence of his revenge shocked even his contemporaries in an age not known for gentleness. John XII's reign came to an appropriately scandalous end. In May 964, at the age of 27, he died suddenly. The circumstances of his death were as controversial as his life. According to Liutprand of Cremona, who admittedly was hostile to John, the Pope died of a stroke while in bed with a married woman. Other accounts suggest the woman's husband caught them in the act and killed John either by throwing him out a window or beating him to death. A third version claims the devil himself struck John dead during the adulterous encounter. The legacy of John XII represents perhaps the absolute nadir of papal history. His pontificate demonstrated how completely the spiritual leadership of Western Christianity could be corrupted by political power and personal vice. Under his rule, the papacy became indistinguishable from the violent, corrupt world of Roman aristocratic politics. The office created to provide moral leadership to Christendom had become a tool for personal gratification and family ambition. Yet John XII's reign had lasting historical consequences. His coronation of Otto I as Holy Roman Emperor established a relationship between the papacy and German monarchy that would shape European politics for centuries. The Holy Roman Empire, which would endure in various forms until 1806, traced its origins to that Christmas Day coronation. The precedent that emperors needed papal coronation for legitimacy would lead to centuries of conflict between popes and emperors. John XII's outrageous behavior also contributed to calls for church reform that would echo through the centuries. His pontificate became a cautionary tale cited by reformers from the 10th century through the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther attacked the corruption of the Renaissance papacy, he could point to historical precedents like John XII as evidence that the institution had long been in need of reform. Modern historians debate how much of the traditional narrative about John the XII is accurate. The primary sources are mostly hostile, written by his political enemies. Bishop Liutprand of Cremona, the source of many salacious stories, was a partisan of Otto I with clear motivation to discredit John. However, the basic outline of John's unsuitability for office, his youth, political machinations, and scandalous behavior appears confirmed by multiple sources. What remains undisputed is that John the XII represents a period when the papacy reached its absolute lowest point, morally and spiritually. The teenager who became pope treated the office as his personal property, using it for political advantage and personal pleasure, with no regard for its religious significance. His reign serves as a reminder that even the most sacred institutions can be corrupted when controlled by those who seek power rather than service. The story of John the XII also illustrates the danger of hereditary religious office. When spiritual leadership becomes a family possession passed down like any other inheritance, it loses its moral authority. John the XII treated the papacy not as a sacred trust, but as an aristocratic privilege, with disastrous results for the Church's credibility. As your consciousness drifts toward sleep, let the scandalous story of the boy pope fade into the shadows of medieval history. In our next chapter, we'll travel to Tudor England to meet a queen whose religious zeal earned her the name Bloody Mary, Mary I, who burned hundreds of Protestants at the stake. But for now, rest peacefully, far from the corrupt halls of 10th century Rome, where sacred office became a tool for profane pleasure. In the year 1516, at Greenwich Palace, a princess was born whose reign would earn her one of the most chilling nicknames in English history. Her name was Mary Tudor, daughter of King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Though she would rule for only 5 years, her zealous campaign to restore Catholicism to England through the execution of nearly 300 Protestants would forever brand her as Bloody Mary, a name that still evokes terror more than 4 centuries after her death. Mary's early life was marked by dramatic reversals of fortune. As the only surviving child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, she was initially treated as heir to the English throne. Her father doted on her, calling her the pearl of his world, and arranged for her to receive an excellent education befitting a future monarch. She studied Latin, French, Spanish, Greek, and Italian, excelling particularly in languages and music. Her early childhood appeared golden, with foreign ambassadors praising her intelligence and refinement. Everything changed when her father became obsessed with producing a male heir. When Catherine failed to give him a surviving son, Henry sought to annul their marriage to wed Anne Boleyn. The Pope's refusal to grant this annulment led Henry to break with Rome, establishing himself as supreme head of the Church of England. This religious revolution would define the rest of Mary's life, as her parents' marriage was declared invalid and she was proclaimed illegitimate. At 17, Mary went from being Princess of Wales and heir to the throne to being called merely Lady Mary, a bastard daughter. She was stripped of her household, forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her infant half-sister Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter. When Mary refused to acknowledge her own illegitimacy or her father's supremacy over the church, she faced her father's wrath. For 3 years, she lived under constant pressure, separated from her mother, and threatened with execution if she did not submit to her father's will. Catherine of Aragon died in 1536, reportedly still loving Henry despite their bitter separation. Mary was not allowed to see her mother in her final days, a cruelty that deepened her resentment. When Anne Boleyn was executed 4 months later and Henry married Jane Seymour, Mary finally agreed to sign documents acknowledging her illegitimacy and her father's religious authority, though friends reported she became physically ill after betraying her principles. For the remainder of Henry's reign, Mary lived quietly, gradually regaining some favor at court. When Henry died in 1547, the throne passed to Mary's 9-year-old half-brother, Edward VI. Under Edward and his Protestant advisors, religious reforms accelerated. The Mass was abolished, priests were allowed to marry, and traditional Catholic practices were forbidden. Mary, who had special permission to hear Mass in her private chapel, became a symbol of Catholic resistance. When Edward died at 15 in 1553, the succession was disputed. Edward's advisors, fearing Mary would reverse the Protestant Reformation, attempted to place Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin, on the throne. But Mary, showing unexpected political skill, rallied support from both Catholics and Protestants who respected legitimate succession. Within days, Jane's support collapsed, and Mary entered London in triumph as England's first queen regnant. Initially, Mary showed relative tolerance. She declared she would not compel or constrain other men's consciences, though she hoped her subjects would follow her in returning to the Catholic faith. She released prominent Catholic prisoners, including the Duke of Norfolk, and began negotiations to restore England's relationship with Rome. Many of her subjects, tired of rapid religious changes, initially welcomed the return to traditional worship. Mary's determination to secure the Catholic restoration led her to seek a powerful Catholic husband. Despite widespread opposition from her council and parliament, she chose her cousin, Philip of Spain, son of Emperor Charles V. The announcement sparked Wyatt's rebellion in 1554, with Protestant gentry fearing Spanish domination. Though Mary showed courage during the crisis, refusing to flee London and rallying her subjects with stirring speeches, the rebellion's suppression marked the beginning of harsher policies. The marriage to Philip proved deeply unpopular and personally disappointing. Philip spent little time in England, clearly more interested in using the marriage for Spanish political advantage than in Mary herself. Despite Mary's devotion to her husband, the marriage produced no children, though twice Mary believed herself pregnant, even exhibiting physical symptoms. These phantom pregnancies became sources of public mockery and personal anguish. The persecution of Protestants began in earnest in 1555 with the revival of medieval heresy laws. The first victim was John Rogers, burned at Smithfield on February 4th, 1555. Over the next 3 years, approximately 283 Protestants were executed by burning, including former Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, Bishops Hugh Latimer, and Nicholas Ridley, and many common people whose only crime was their religious belief. The burnings predominantly occurred in southeastern England, particularly in London, Canterbury, and Colchester. The victims included not just religious leaders, but ordinary people, weavers, laborers, and housewives. The executions were public spectacles intended to frighten people back to Catholicism. Instead, they often had the opposite effect. Protestant writers like John Foxe would later immortalize these victims in his Book of Martyrs, creating a powerful Protestant mythology of resistance to Catholic tyranny. The persecution intensified as Mary's reign progressed. Some victims were burned alive, while others had gunpowder hung around their necks to hasten death, a mercy not always granted. The courage shown by many martyrs, who often sang hymns or prayed aloud as they burned, turned public opinion against the Queen. Even some Catholics grew uncomfortable with the severity of the persecution. Mary's reign faced other challenges beyond religious conflict. In 1557, England lost Calais, its last French possession held since the Hundred Years' War. Mary reportedly said that when she died, Calais would be found written on her heart. This military humiliation, combined with poor harvests, epidemics, and economic problems, turned public sentiment increasingly against the Queen. Throughout her reign, Mary remained convinced that England's problems stemmed from its rejection of the true faith. She believed that by restoring Catholicism and eliminating heresy, she was saving her subjects' souls. This religious certainty blinded her to the growing unpopularity of her policies. Her advisors, including Cardinal Reginald Pole, reinforced her beliefs rather than counseling moderation. Mary died on November 17, 1558, at age 42, possibly from ovarian cancer or uterine cancer. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, but left instructions for masses to be said for her soul, instructions her Protestant successor would ignore. Elizabeth I, who ascended the throne upon Mary's death, quickly reversed the Catholic Restoration, restoring the Protestant Church of England that remains to this day. History has not been kind to Mary Tudor. The nickname Bloody Mary has overshadowed the complexities of her reign and character. She was England's first queen regnant, successfully claiming the throne in her own right and defending it against rebellion. She showed personal courage during crises and maintained her convictions despite enormous pressure to abandon them. Yet her reign is remembered primarily for religious persecution. The tragedy of Mary's life lies partly in timing. Had she ruled a century earlier, her actions might have been seen as typical medieval piety. Had she ruled a century later, religious tolerance might have offered different options. Instead, she ruled during the Reformation's most violent phase, when religious identity was inseparable from political loyalty, and compromise seemed impossible to true believers on both sides. Modern historians note that Mary's reputation for brutality is somewhat unfair when compared to her contemporaries. Her father, Henry VIII, executed far more people, including 2 of his wives. Elizabeth I would execute approximately 400 Catholics during her longer reign, while contemporary European rulers often exceeded Mary's death toll. Yet Bloody Mary endures in popular memory, while other rulers' violence is forgotten or contextually excused. The psychological impact of Mary's early life cannot be ignored when assessing her reign. The trauma of her parents' divorce, her own illegitimization, the forced separation from her mother, and years of pressure to deny her faith likely contributed to the inflexibility that characterized her rule. Her phantom pregnancies suggest deep psychological distress, while her devotion to Philip of Spain reveals a longing for personal affection repeatedly denied throughout her life. Mary's legacy primarily lies in the reaction against her policies. The Marian persecutions created a Protestant martyrology that would influence English national identity for centuries. Fear of Catholic persecution became deeply embedded in English culture, affecting everything from foreign policy to literature. The annual celebration of Guy Fawkes Night, commemorating the failed Catholic plot to blow up Parliament in 1605, reflects anxieties that Mary's reign helped establish. Under different circumstances, Mary might have been remembered as a scholarly, pious queen who tried to heal her nation's religious divisions. Instead, her unwavering commitment to restoring Catholicism through force created martyrs whose stories would inspire Protestant resistance for generations. Her reign demonstrates how religious certainty, when combined with political power, can lead even well-intentioned rulers to commit acts their contemporaries and history judge as cruel. As you drift towards sleep, let the tragic story of Mary Tudor fade into the mists of history. In our next chapter, we'll travel to ancient China to meet Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor whose quest for immortality and absolute control led to the burning of books and burial of scholars alive. But for now, rest peacefully, far from the flames of Smithfield and the religious strife that tore 16th century England apart. In the year 259 before Christ, in the ancient state of Qin, a child was born who would unite China for the first time in history, but whose reign would be remembered as much for its cruelty as its achievements. His birth name was Ying Zheng, but history knows him as Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. His legacy includes both the magnificent Great Wall and terracotta army, and the infamous burning of books and burial of scholars alive, earning him a place among history's most controversial rulers. The future emperor's early life was marked by political intrigue and danger. His father, King Zhuangxiang of Qin, had spent years as a hostage in the rival state of Zhao, where Yingzheng was born. Some historical accounts suggest his real father might have been the wealthy merchant Lu Buwei, who had given his pregnant concubine to the prince as part of a complex political scheme. When Yingzheng was 9 years old, his father became king of Qin, making the boy crown prince. At age 13, following his father's death in 246 BC, Yingzheng ascended to the throne of Qin. For the first years of his reign, power was held by the regent Lu Buwei and the queen dowager. The young king witnessed constant palace intrigues, including a shocking scandal when his mother took a lover named Lao Ai, who posed as a eunuch to gain access to the palace. Lao Ai eventually fathered 2 children with the queen dowager and plotted rebellion, which the young king ruthlessly crushed. By age 22, Yingzheng had eliminated all rivals and assumed full control of Qin. He then embarked on a series of military campaigns to conquer the 6 other major Chinese states. Using a combination of superior military technology, strategic brilliance, and diplomatic deception, he systematically defeated Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, and finally Qi. By 221 BC, he had achieved what no ruler had done before, uniting all of China under a single government. To mark this unprecedented achievement, Yingzheng created a new title for himself, Qin Shi Huangdi, meaning First Emperor of Qin. The character Huangdi combined terms previously used only for mythological sage rulers and gods, reflecting his view of himself as more than mortal. He declared that his dynasty would last 10,000 generations, with his successors to be numbered second emperor, third emperor, and so on into eternity. The first emperor immediately set about standardizing everything in his new empire. He unified weights, measures, and currency, making trade and taxation more efficient. He standardized the writing system, creating the foundation for modern Chinese characters. Even the width of cart axles was standardized so that all vehicles would fit the same road ruts. These reforms, while imposed by force, created the administrative unity that would characterize China for over 2,000 years. One of Qin Shi Huang's most ambitious projects was the construction of a network of roads and canals connecting his vast empire. The imperial highways stretched over 4,000 miles with a standard width of 50 paces. Trees lined these roads to provide shade, and post stations every 10 miles offered fresh horses for imperial messengers. This infrastructure allowed rapid military deployment and efficient administration, but was built through forced labor that cost countless lives. The emperor's most famous construction project began as a defensive measure against northern nomadic tribes. By connecting and expanding existing fortifications, he created what would become the Great Wall of China. Hundreds of thousands of workers, soldiers, peasants, and convicts labored on the wall. Many died during construction and were buried within the wall itself, leading to its grim nickname as the longest cemetery on earth. Qin Shi Huang's obsession with control extended to the realm of thought. In 213 BC, on the advice of his chancellor Li Si, he ordered the burning of books throughout the empire. Only texts on medicine, agriculture, and divination were spared. Historical records, philosophical works, and poetry, especially Confucian texts that criticized harsh governance, were destroyed. Owners who failed to burn forbidden books within 30 days faced execution. The following year, the emperor took his suppression of dissent even further. When Confucian scholars criticized his policies, he allegedly ordered 460 of them buried alive, though some historians argue they were executed by other means. This event, known as the burning of books and burying of scholars, became symbolic of intellectual persecution and cemented his reputation as a tyrant in Confucian historical tradition. The first emperor lived in constant fear of assassination and death. He survived at least 3 assassination attempts, including the famous incident with Jing Kai, who concealed a poisoned dagger in a map. These experiences made him increasingly paranoid. He never slept in the same room twice, had multiple identical palaces built, and traveled in disguise. His fear of death led to an obsession with finding the elixir of immortality. Qin Shi Huang sent expeditions across his empire and beyond searching for immortality potions and mythical islands where immortals supposedly lived. He consulted alchemists, magicians, and shamans, spending vast resources on their promises of eternal life. Ironically, the mercury-based potions he consumed to extend his life probably hastened his death. Modern analysis of soil samples from his tomb shows extremely high mercury levels. The Emperor's Tomb Complex, discovered in 1974, reveals the extraordinary scale of his burial preparations. The famous terracotta army, over 8,000 life-sized clay soldiers, horses, and chariots, was created to protect him in the afterlife. Each warrior has unique facial features, suggesting they were modeled after real soldiers. The tomb itself, still unexcavated, is said to contain rivers of mercury representing China's waterways and a ceiling studded with pearls depicting the night sky. Despite his precautions, Qin Shi Huang died in 210 ABC at age 49 while on a tour of eastern China. The cause of death remains uncertain, possibly mercury poisoning from his immortality elixirs or natural causes. His death was kept secret by officials who feared chaos. They disguised the smell of his decomposing body by surrounding his carriage with carts of rotting fish while they raced back to the capital. The first emperor's death even triggered the collapse of his dynasty. His chosen heir was murdered in a palace coup, and the second emperor proved incompetent. Within 4 years, widespread rebellions erupted across China. Peasants, exhausted by forced labor and heavy taxes, joined former nobles in revolt. The Qin dynasty, which was meant to last 10,000 generations, collapsed after only 15 years. The Han dynasty that followed adopted many of Qin Shi Huang's administrative innovations while moderating his harsh policies. Later, Chinese historians, predominantly Confucian scholars, whose intellectual ancestors had suffered under his rule, painted him as the archetypal tyrant. Yet they continued using the governmental structure he created, acknowledging that his ruthless unification had forged China into a lasting political entity. Modern assessment of Qin Shi Huang remains divided. His achievements were revolutionary, ending centuries of warfare between states, creating the world's first centralized bureaucratic empire, standardizing culture and infrastructure, and building monuments that still inspire awe. The political unity he imposed became the ideal that future Chinese dynasties would strive to maintain or restore. Yet these achievements came at a horrific human cost. Hundreds of thousands died building his walls, roads, palaces, and tomb. His thought control policies destroyed countless irreplaceable texts and killed numerous scholars. His harsh legalist philosophy treated people as resources to be exploited for state purposes. The speed and brutality of his reforms created the very instability that doomed his dynasty. Qin Shi Huang embodies the paradox of the transformative tyrant. Like Peter the Great of Russia or Ataturk of Turkey, he dragged his society into a new era through sheer force of will. His reforms created lasting benefits, but through methods that caused immense immediate suffering. He unified China, but at the cost of cultural diversity. He created efficient administration, but suppressed intellectual freedom. Perhaps most tellingly, while the first emperor's dynasty lasted only 15 years, the title he created, Huangdi, or Emperor, remained in use for over 2,000 years until the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912. The governmental structure he established became the template for imperial China. Even today, the People's Republic of China governs a territory remarkably similar to the one he first unified. Qin Shi Huang's legacy raises enduring questions about the price of progress and the role of ruthlessness in leadership. His reign demonstrates how the same qualities, single-minded determination, intolerance of opposition, willingness to sacrifice individuals for collective goals, can produce both great achievements and great atrocities. He remains a reminder that historical judgment must weigh not just what leaders accomplish, but how they accomplish it and at what human cost. As your consciousness drifts toward sleep, let the story of China's first emperor fade into the ancient past. In our next chapter, we'll meet Richard II of England, whose vanity and tyranny led to his overthrow and murder, setting the stage for the Wars of the Roses. But for now, rest peacefully, far from the buried books and entombed warriors of Qin Shi Huang's China. In the year 1367, at Bordeaux in English controlled Aquitaine, a prince was born who would become one of England's most controversial monarchs. His name was Richard of Bordeaux, son of Edward the Black Prince and grandson of Edward III. As Richard II, he would ascend to the throne as a child, show early promise as a brave young king, but ultimately descend into tyranny and madness, becoming the first English monarch to be formally deposed by Parliament. Richard's path to the throne was marked by tragedy. His father, the Black Prince, was one of medieval England's greatest military heroes, victor of the battles of Crécy and Poitiers. However, the prince contracted what historians believe was dysentery while campaigning in Spain and died in 1376 when Richard was only 9 years old. A year later, Richard's grandfather, as Edward III, died, making the 10-year-old boy King of England. The young king inherited a realm facing multiple crises. The 100 Years' War with France was going badly. The Black Death had decimated the population, and heavy taxation to fund military campaigns had created widespread discontent. Real power during Richard's minority rested with his uncles, particularly John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. These powerful nobles managed the kingdom while the boy king was educated in the arts of kingship. Richard's first test came dramatically in 1381 during the Peasants' Revolt. When thousands of rebels marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom and the poll tax, the 14-year-old king rode out to meet them at Smithfield. When the rebel leader, Wat Tyler, was killed during negotiations, Richard faced the angry crowd and supposedly declared, "You shall have no captain but me." He promised to address their grievances, successfully dispersing the rebels, though he later reneged on these promises, declaring, "Villains ye are, and villains ye shall remain." This incident revealed both Richard's courage and his duplicity. As he grew older, he developed increasingly autocratic ideas about kingship. Unlike his warrior grandfather and father, Richard preferred diplomacy to warfare and art to martial pursuits. He patronized poets like Geoffrey Chaucer, commissioned beautiful illuminated manuscripts, and developed elaborate court ceremonies. He also began to articulate a theory of absolute monarchy that alarmed the nobility. Richard's relationship with his nobles deteriorated throughout the 1380s. He surrounded himself with favorites, particularly Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford, whom he elevated to the unprecedented title of Duke of Ireland. The established nobility, led by the Duke of Gloucester, Richard's uncle, and the Earl of Arundel, formed an opposition group that became known as the Lords Appellant. In 1387, they effectively seized control of government, executing or exiling Richard's favorites. For several years, Richard was forced to accept the dominance of the Lords Appellant. However, he never forgave this humiliation. By 1397, having carefully rebuilt his power base, Richard struck back with calculated vengeance. He had the Duke of Gloucester arrested and murdered in Calais. The Earl of Arundel was executed, and the Earl of Warwick was exiled. Even those who had supported him were not safe. He later exiled Henry Bolingbroke, the future Henry IV, and confiscated his inheritance. Richard's concept of kingship became increasingly extreme. He insisted on elaborate ceremonies of deference, requiring nobles to address him on bended knee. He created a private army of Cheshire archers who wore his personal badge and acted as his enforcers. He claimed that the laws of England existed only in his own breast and that he could change them at will. Court records show him declaring, "The laws are in my mouth." The king's behavior became increasingly erratic and paranoid. He would sit on his throne for hours, requiring all present to kneel if his gaze fell upon them. He began compiling lists of subjects he considered potentially disloyal, demanding that they purchase expensive blank charters that he could fill in with any crimes he chose. These blank charters effectively allowed him to extort money from his subjects under threat of arbitrary prosecution. Richard also developed delusions of grandeur regarding England's history. He commissioned histories that traced the English monarchy back to the biblical King David and had himself portrayed in art as a Christ-like figure. He even attempted to have his great-grandfather, Edward II, who had been deposed and murdered for his own misrule, canonized as a saint, perhaps seeing parallels between Edward's fate and his own potential future. The final crisis of Richard's reign began in 1398, when he banished his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, initially for 10 years, later extended to life. When Bolingbroke's father, John of Gaunt, died in 1399, Richard made the fatal error of confiscating the vast Lancastrian inheritance. This act united the nobility against him, as it threatened the hereditary rights of all peers. When Richard led an expedition to Ireland in 1399 to suppress a rebellion, Bolingbroke saw his opportunity. He landed in Yorkshire with a small force, claiming he sought only his rightful inheritance. However, as nobles flocked to his banner, his aims expanded. Richard's supporters melted away, and when the king returned from Ireland, he found himself virtually abandoned. Trapped in Wales with a handful of followers, Richard was forced to negotiate with Bolingbroke at Flint Castle. Though promised his throne would be respected if he restored Bolingbroke's lands, Richard was instead taken to London as a prisoner. There, under pressure from Parliament and threats of violence, he was compelled to abdicate in Westminster Hall on September the 29th, 1399. The official record states he resigned willingly, but contemporary accounts suggest he protested that a king could not legally abdicate. Parliament then formally deposed Richard, presenting 33 articles of accusation against him. These included tyrannical government, violation of laws and customs, unjust taxation, and the murder of his uncle Gloucester. Henry Bolingbroke was proclaimed King Henry IV, establishing the Lancastrian dynasty. Richard was imprisoned, first in the Tower of London, then at Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire. Richard's final months remain shrouded in mystery. The official account states he died at Pontefract Castle on February 14th, 1400, at age 33. Henry IV claimed Richard starved himself to death in despair, but many contemporaries believed he was murdered on the new king's orders. Some accounts say he was starved deliberately. Others suggest he was hacked to death by assassins. His body was displayed in London to prove he was dead, but rumors persisted for years that he had escaped to Scotland. Richard II's deposition marked a crucial turning point in English constitutional history. For the first time, Parliament had formally deposed an anointed king, establishing the precedent that monarchs ruled not by divine right alone, but by consent of the realm. This principle would have profound implications, contributing to the eventual development of constitutional monarchy. The tragedy of Richard's reign inspired one of Shakespeare's greatest history plays. Shakespeare's Richard II portrays him as a poet king destroyed by his own weaknesses, his vanity, his disregard for practical governance, and his belief in the divine right of kings. The playwright captures both Richard's genuine suffering and the dangers of his absolutist philosophy. Richard's reign also set in motion the dynastic conflicts that would culminate in the Wars of the Roses. His deposition established the competing claims of the Lancastrian and Yorkist branches of the royal family. Though Henry IV would rule successfully, questions about the legitimacy of his usurpation would haunt his descendants, contributing to decades of civil war. Modern historians have somewhat rehabilitated Richard's reputation. His patronage of arts and culture, including support for Geoffrey Chaucer, contributed to the flowering of English literature. His diplomatic initiatives, particularly his truce with France, showed statesmanship. Some scholars argue that his concept of kingship, while extreme by medieval standards, was not unusual for the period, and that his downfall resulted more from political miscalculation than inherent tyranny. However, Richard's fundamental failure lay in his inability to work within the constraints of medieval kingship. English monarchs, unlike some of their continental counterparts, had always ruled in consultation with their nobility. Richard's attempt to establish absolute monarchy violated these traditions, alienating the very class whose support was essential for effective governance. His reign serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked royal power and the importance of political consensus. Richard possessed intelligence, courage, and cultural sophistication, but his obsession with royal prerogative and his vindictive treatment of opponents ultimately destroyed him. He remains one of history's most complex bad rulers, neither a simple tyrant nor a mere victim of circumstances. As your mind drifts toward sleep, let the story of Richard II fade into the medieval past. In our next chapter, we'll meet Emperor Rudolph II, whose obsession with alchemy and the occult plunged the Holy Roman Empire into chaos and religious war. But for now, rest peacefully, far from the dangerous courts of 14th century England, where kings could be unmade as well as made. In the year 1552, at the Spanish court in Vienna, a prince was born who would become one of history's most peculiar rulers. His name was Rudolph, son of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II and Maria of Spain. As Rudolph II, he would transform his court at Prague into a center for alchemists, astrologers, and mystics, while his neglect of governing plunged Central Europe into religious warfare that would devastate the continent for 30 years. Rudolph spent his formative years at the court of his uncle, King Philip II of Spain, one of the most rigid and protocol-bound courts in Europe. This strict Catholic environment profoundly affected the young prince, who developed a deep interest in religious mysticism alongside an intense fear of damnation. However, unlike his fanatically Catholic uncle, Rudolph's spiritual interests would lead him down far more esoteric paths. When Rudolph became Holy Roman Emperor in 1576, at age 24, he inherited a realm already fracturing along religious lines. The Protestant Reformation had split Germany into hostile camps, while the Ottoman Empire threatened from the east. These challenges required a decisive, engaged ruler. Instead, Rudolph increasingly withdrew from public affairs, becoming obsessed with his vast collection of art, curiosities, and his pursuit of occult knowledge. In 1583, Rudolph moved his court from Vienna to Prague Castle, transforming the Bohemian capital into what contemporaries called a new Alexandria. He assembled the most extensive Kunstkammer, cabinet of curiosities, in Europe, filling entire wings of Prague Castle with natural specimens, scientific instruments, works of art, and objects believed to possess magical properties. His collection included everything from unicorn horns, actually narwhal tusks, to perpetual motion machines to paintings by Dürer and Bruegel. The emperor's true passion, however, was the occult sciences. He appointed the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe as imperial mathematician, later replacing him with Johannes Kepler. While both made groundbreaking astronomical discoveries under Rudolph's patronage, the emperor was less interested in their scientific work than in their astrological predictions. He consulted horoscopes before making any decision and kept a permanent staff of astrologers. Rudolph's court attracted alchemists from across Europe, all promising to reveal the secrets of transmutation, turning base metals into gold, or to create the philosopher's stone that would grant immortality. Edward Kelly, an English mystic who claimed to communicate with angels, became a favorite until Rudolph imprisoned him for failing to produce gold. The emperor spent vast sums funding alchemical experiments, building special laboratories throughout Prague Castle. The emperor's mental state deteriorated throughout his reign. He suffered from what modern physicians might diagnose as severe depression and paranoid delusions. He would isolate himself for months, refusing to see ministers or sign official documents. When he did emerge, he often issued contradictory orders or became fixated on trivial matters while ignoring crucial state business. He lived in constant fear of assassination, changing his bedroom nightly and employing food tasters. As Rudolph retreated into his private world, his empire faced mounting crises. He refused to marry or produce an heir, fearing any wife might poison him or any child might seek to overthrow him. This created a succession crisis that his ambitious younger brother Matthias eagerly exploited. More dangerously, Rudolph's indecisiveness in religious matters alienated both Catholics and Protestants. In Bohemia, Rudolph issued a letter of majesty in 1609, granting religious freedom to Protestants, but then failed to enforce it consistently. In Hungary, his weakness encouraged noble revolts. In the German states, Catholic and Protestant princes formed military alliances, preparing for the conflict that would become the 30 Years' War. Rudolph's inability to provide leadership left a power vacuum that regional leaders filled, often violently. The emperor's obsession with the occult reached dangerous levels when he became convinced he could communicate with the dead and command demons. He conducted midnight seances in Prague Castle and collected grimoires, books of magic, from across Europe. When the Catholic Church expressed concern about these activities, Rudolph simply stopped attending Mass, further alienating religious conservatives. By 1608, Rudolph's own family moved against him. His brother Matthias, supported by other Habsburg archdukes, forced Rudolf to cede control of Austria, Hungary, and Moravia. Rudolf retained only Bohemia and the imperial title. Isolated and increasingly paranoid, he attempted to form alliances with Protestant princes against his own Catholic family, creating further chaos in imperial politics. The final crisis came in 1611 when Matthias invaded Bohemia with an army. Rudolf's own subjects, tired of his erratic rule, offered no resistance. The emperor was forced to abdicate the Bohemian crown to his brother while retaining only the now meaningless title of Holy Roman Emperor. He spent his final months as a virtual prisoner in Prague Castle, surrounded by his collections but stripped of all real power. Rudolf died on January 20th, 1612, at age 59. According to witnesses, his last days were spent in his laboratory, still searching for the philosopher's stone. He was buried in Prague's St. Vitus Cathedral, but his magnificent collections were gradually dispersed after his death. Matthias succeeded him as Holy Roman Emperor, but inherited an empire on the brink of collapse. Just 6 years after Rudolf's death, the defenestration of Prague, when Protestant nobles threw Catholic officials from a window of Prague Castle, sparked the 30 Years' War. This devastating conflict, which killed between 4 and 12 million people, arose directly from the religious and political tensions that Rudolf had failed to address during his reign. Despite his failures as a ruler, Rudolf's patronage of arts and sciences had lasting positive effects. Under his sponsorship, Tycho Brahe compiled the most accurate astronomical observations of the pre-telescopic era, data that Johannes Kepler used to formulate his laws of planetary motion. The artistic works Rudolf commissioned, particularly from Giuseppe Arcimboldo and Bartholomeus Spranger, pioneered the Mannerist style in Central Europe. Rudolf's Prague also became a haven for intellectual freedom during a time of increasing religious persecution. Jews, Protestants, Catholics, and even Hermetic philosophers could work together at his court. This atmosphere of tolerance, though born from indifference rather than principle, fostered significant cultural and scientific advancement. Modern historians debate whether Rudolf suffered from what would now be diagnosed as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or severe depression. His symptoms, alternating between manic collecting sprees and months of isolated depression, paranoid delusions, and obsessive behaviors, suggest serious mental illness. Some argue this makes him more tragic than evil, a man thrust into a position his fragile psyche couldn't handle. However, regardless of the medical explanation, Rudolf's reign demonstrates the dangers of escapism in leadership. While he pursued his esoteric interests in the safety of Prague Castle, his empire descended into the religious conflicts that would devastate Central Europe for a generation. His failure to address real problems while chasing alchemical dreams and astrological predictions led directly to one of European history's most destructive wars. Rudolf II represents a unique category among history's failed rulers, the absent leader. Unlike tyrants who actively oppressed their subjects, Rudolf simply retreated from his responsibilities. Yet his neglect proved as destructive as active malevolence, showing that sometimes the worst rulers are those who refuse to rule at all. The emperor's story also illustrates the tension between Renaissance intellectual curiosity and medieval political realities. Rudolf's court anticipated the scientific revolution, with its emphasis on observation and experimentation. Yet his personal obsessions prevented him from addressing the practical challenges of governance in an era of religious warfare. Today, tourists visiting Prague can still see remnants of Rudolph's extraordinary collections in the city's museums and the castle he made his refuge. The astronomical clock he commissioned still marks time in the old town square, a mechanical reminder of an emperor who was more interested in the movements of the stars than the affairs of his own empire. As you drift toward sleep, let the strange tale of the alchemist emperor fade into history. In our final chapter, we'll journey to 19th century Madagascar to meet Queen Ranavalona I, whose xenophobic policies and brutal persecution turned her island kingdom into a fortress of suffering. But for now, rest peacefully, far from the mystical laboratories and neglected throne rooms of Rudolph's Prague. In the year 1788, on the island of Madagascar, a princess was born who would become one of the most feared and controversial rulers in African history. Her name was Ramavo, later known as Ranavalona Stephens, and her 33-year reign would transform Madagascar into a hermetically sealed kingdom where traditional customs were preserved through extreme violence. Her brutal policies would result in the deaths of possibly half her subjects, earning her the epithets the Mad Queen and the female Caligula. Ramavo was born into the Marina royal family, though not in direct line for the throne. Her path to power began when she married Radama, the progressive young king who had opened Madagascar to European influence and modernization. Radama collaborated with the British, abolished the slave trade, welcomed Christian missionaries, and introduced European-style military training. These reforms, while modernizing, also threatened traditional Malagasy culture and the privileges of the nobility. When Radama died suddenly in 1828 at age 36, officially from alcoholism, though many suspected poison, a succession crisis erupted. According to traditional law, the throne should have passed to Radama's nephew. However, Ramavo, now known as Ranavalona, seized power with the support of conservative nobles who opposed westernization. Her first act as queen was to execute all potential rivals to the throne, including Radama's mother and his chosen heir. Ranavalona immediately reversed her late husband's policies. She expelled most European missionaries, banned the practice of Christianity, and required all foreigners to either leave Madagascar or submit to Malagasy law. She declared herself the guardian of traditional Malagasy culture and religion, positioning her reign as a return to ancestral ways. This xenophobic policy would define her entire rule. The queen revived and intensified the traditional Malagasy practice of trial by ordeal, known as tangina. This involved forcing accused persons to drink poison made from the tangina nut. If they vomited and survived, they were declared innocent. If they died, their guilt was confirmed. During Ranavalona's reign, an estimated 100,000 people died from tangina ordeals, often accused of witchcraft, conspiracy, or practicing Christianity. Ranavalona's persecution of Christians was particularly severe. She viewed Christianity as a foreign threat to traditional ancestor worship and royal authority. Christians were subjected to torture, execution, and enslavement. Many were thrown from cliffs, burned alive, or sentenced to hard labor in malaria-infested swamps. Despite this persecution, the underground Christian community grew, with converts finding inspiration in martyrdom. The queen's paranoia extended beyond religious matters. She created an extensive spy network throughout the kingdom, encouraging subjects to inform on one another. Those accused of disloyalty faced brutal punishment. Public executions became regular spectacles, with methods including boiling in oil, progressive dismemberment, and being sewn into ox hides and left in the sun until the shrinking leather crushed the victim. One of Ranavalona's most infamous projects was the construction of a massive palace complex using forced labor. Tens of thousands of her subjects were conscripted to haul enormous logs up steep hills to the capital, Antananarivo. Many died from exhaustion, disease, or accidents during construction. The queen viewed such losses as acceptable sacrifices for royal glory. This project, combined with military campaigns, devastated the working age population. The queen's military campaigns were equally destructive. She launched annual expeditions to raid neighboring tribes and suppress rebellions. These campaigns relied on forced conscription and scorched earth tactics. Soldiers were expected to live off the land, leading to widespread famine as armies stripped regions of food. Military service became so feared that many young men mutilated themselves or fled to avoid conscription. In foreign policy, Ranavalona pursued radical isolationism. She restricted foreign trade to a few coastal points and required European traders to submit to Malagasy law. When French traders at Toamasina, Tamatave, refused to comply with new regulations in 1845, she ordered the town bombarded and the Europeans expelled. This action nearly led to war with France, avoided only because the French government was preoccupied with other colonial ventures. The Queen's economic policies proved disastrous. By restricting foreign trade and expelling European technicians, she deprived Madagascar of crucial imports and technical knowledge. Traditional industries declined without markets or innovation. The constant warfare and forced labor disrupted agriculture, leading to periodic famines. Yet Ranavalona maintained that economic hardship was preferable to foreign domination. Ranavalona's personal life was marked by intrigue and violence. She never remarried after Radama's death, but took numerous lovers, some of whom gained significant political influence. Her favorites could rise to great power, but faced execution if they fell from favor. She adopted a nephew as her heir, but later became suspicious of him, subjecting him to house arrest and surveillance. Despite her brutality, Ranavalona maintained legitimacy through skillful manipulation of traditional beliefs. She presented herself as the living embodiment of Malagasy sovereignty and the protector of ancestral customs. Many subjects, even while suffering under her policies, viewed her as a bulwark against foreign domination. This complex relationship between ruler and ruled complicates simple portrayal of her as merely a tyrant. The queen's xenophobia wasn't entirely irrational. She had witnessed how European influence often preceded colonization in other parts of Africa and Asia. Her extreme measures, while brutal, did preserve Madagascar's independence during an era when much of Africa was being carved up by European powers. This achievement partly explains why some modern Malagasy nationalists view her more favorably than contemporary European accounts suggest. Ranavalona died on August 16, 1861, at age 73, having ruled for 33 years. Her death was kept secret for several days while the succession was secured. Her son, Radama II, immediately reversed most of her policies, reopening Madagascar to European influence and welcoming back missionaries and traders. However, his rapid westernization alarmed conservatives, leading to his assassination just 2 years later. Estimating the death toll from Ranavalona's reign remains difficult. Some historians suggest that Madagascar's population declined from 5 million to 2.5 million during her rule, though this includes deaths from natural causes and emigration. What seems certain is that hundreds of thousands died from executions, forced labor, military campaigns, and famine resulting from her policies. Ranavalona's legacy remains controversial. European contemporary accounts portrayed her as a bloodthirsty monster, the female Nero, whose reign was an orgy of cruelty. These accounts are written by missionaries and traders she expelled, undoubtedly exaggerated some atrocities while ignoring the colonial context that shaped her actions. Some modern Malagasy historians attempt to rehabilitate her as an anti colonial figure who preserved Madagascar's independence. The truth likely lies between these extremes. Ranavalona was undoubtedly cruel by any standard, responsible for massive suffering among her people. Yet she also successfully resisted European colonization during a critical period, maintaining Madagascar's independence until 1896, longer than most African nations. Her methods were brutal, but her goal of preserving Malagasy sovereignty resonates with post colonial perspectives. Her reign illustrates the tragic paradox faced by many non Western rulers in the colonial era: how to modernize enough to resist foreign domination without losing cultural identity. Ranavalona chose extreme traditionalism and isolation, which preserved independence at horrific human cost. Other rulers who chose accommodation with Europeans often lost their kingdoms entirely. Today, Ranavalona remains a complex figure in Malagasy history. Her palace still dominates Antananarivo's skyline, a reminder of both royal power and the suffering required to build it. Some view her as Madagascar's last truly independent ruler before colonial subjugation. Others see her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of xenophobia and absolute power. As we conclude our journey through history's worst rulers, Ranavalona's story offers a fitting final meditation on the nature of power and its corruption. Like many rulers in our chronicle, she began with arguably legitimate goals, preserving her nation's independence and culture. Yet the methods she chose transformed her into the very monster she claimed to fight against, showing how even defensive nationalism can become destructive tyranny. Our exploration of history's worst rulers reveals common patterns: the corruption of idealism, the dangers of absolute power, the human cost of grand visions, and the thin line between strong leadership and tyranny. From Caligula's divine pretensions to Pol Pot's agrarian utopia, from Leopold's colonial exploitation to Ranavalona's fierce independence, these rulers remind us that power without accountability, vision without humanity, and fear without mercy create not greatness, but tragedy. As you drift into peaceful slumber, far from the cruelties of history, may these tales serve as gentle reminders of the importance of compassion, humility, and wisdom in leadership. Let the stories of these rulers fade into the quiet night, leaving only the lesson that true greatness lies not in the power to destroy, but in the wisdom to build and preserve. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with visions of a more just and gentle world.